Oh, these roses are gorgeous. What's the occasion for such a gorgeous bouquet? Grace asked. Is it for me? Or are we going to someone's house? You're a champion. Honey, I love you. Kieran held out roses to Grace. You know that, don't you? So without further ado, marry me. Grace waited for a moment for further developments. Then she raised her eyebrows and said disappointedly, Is that all? What do you mean? I don't understand, replied Kieran. Isn't that a marriage proposal? Silly. What do you mean? I want you to be my wife, to live a long and happy life together, to have children. I don't understand. Is that the best you can do? Grace asked unhappily. Where's the celebration? Where's the ring? You should at least look on the internet to see how men propose to girls. We'll go to a restaurant and celebrate, said Kieran. What about the ring? What about the video of you proposing? Grace, what's the big deal? We love each other, we want to get married. What's all the fuss? What's with all the hoopla? I'm a simple man. I'm just saying what I can say. I want a ring for your marriage proposal, said Grace, resentfully. Everyone will laugh at me when I tell them you proposed and didn't give me a ring. Grace let out a tear. God, I'll be embarrassed in front of the others. And even embarrassed. I'd be humiliated to the core. Who's going to ask you about the ring? Who needs it? Is it so fundamental? You have to have a ring and no other way. I just thought it would be better to use the money for a trip after the wedding. Kieran smiled and hugged Grace. That'll be the ring for you. You're crazy, she pushed him away, her tears drying in a flash. A wedding trip. You're clearly out of your mind. What haven't we seen? Hanging around in buses, swallowing dust, listening to tedious lectures from tour guides. What kind of wedding trip is that? It's horrible. Who would you tell about a honeymoon like that? We'd be laughed at, Grace said, indignantly. People go abroad and we're like idiots on some itinerary. We should go to Turkey as a last resort. Who's going to laugh? Kieran was getting nervous. Who cares about our lives? Grace, you're saying the wrong thing. Turkey can wait. We haven't seen anything here. And I don't want to see anything here, Grace said sharply. What's good here? Married. I want a good life, to be envied, not pitied. Well, don't all your friends get a ring and go abroad? I know some of them don't even have boyfriends and don't get married. Why do I have to settle for the worst? I want the best. Kieran. Grace laughed out of turn and hugged him. When should one want everything but when one is young? Later, when we are old and sick, we shall not want anything. But now I want it. I really want the ring, and Turkey, and the video. I'm afraid your demands don't match my possibilities, said Kieran sadly. What else do you want to know here on the shore? Or when we're going to set sail for the voyage of a lifetime? I'm afraid I can't give you what you want. I also want a home, our home, or home, where it's just you and me and our children, where there's no one else, no parents, no grandparents. Just you and me, Grace said. I wanted this to be a surprise to you, Kieran smiled. I'll tell you. You and I are going to have a house like this, or rather we already have one. My grandmother will move in with my mom and dad, and we'll move into her house. My grandmother gave me a gift. She gave me a deed to her house. Can you believe it, Grace? Grace looked at her husband to be satisfied face. The smile slipped from her face, and from the expression on her face, Kieran realized that the surprise had failed. What kind of house is this? Grace said with a tone that tolerated no objection. It's a 60s Khrushchevka. My idea of a house is at least 2 stories, floor-to-ceiling windows, underfloor heating. And I walk barefoot on the warm floor. Look through these windows and enjoy this house. This is home. Grace, your dreams are unrealistic, Kieran objected. Other people live in apartments all their lives. They don't have a place to live and don't expect to. We have a whole house, 4 rooms, a kitchen, a veranda. We can add a bathroom. Why should we add new old things to old things? It is old, Grace said. And then, I told you before, why should we look up to those who are doing worse than we are? We have to reach for the best, strive for it, and then everything will work out. I'm sure of it. You'll see, Kieran. Everything will work out and we'll have everything. You just have to want it badly enough. I see that potential in you. Otherwise, I wouldn't have chosen you and loved you. I will always be there for you and support you because I love you so much. I love you so much. Let's start over. Do what again? Kieran didn't understand. I accept the bouquet. It's not going anywhere. Flowers don't last forever. And you properly organize a marriage proposal. Get ready. Buy a ring, but make sure it's a diamond. Even if it's small, it has to be a diamond. Book a restaurant, invite your friends, have a professional video shoot, maybe some fireworks, the whole thing. Grace, I don't like the whole staged thing. It just feels so fake to me. I'll feel like a clown. Love is a two-person feeling. It likes silence, not fireworks. And I really, really want it all. For me, for my lovely future wife. Can you make it happen? I need it, Kieran. She looked ingratiatingly into his eyes and asked, Please, Kieran. Kieran once again tried to convince Grace that this was an unpleasant situation for him. Grace, here you keep saying that you want to be envied. Why would you do that? Because everyone knows that envy is a bad thing, both for the person who's envious and the person who's envious. I feel good when I'm envied. It makes me feel so euphoric, so energized. So sweet, Grace replied. Naughty. She laughed. That's the kind of wife you're going to have, Kieran. Not vicious, but determined. I look envious men in the eye and taunt them with my superiority over them, the wretches. Grace, you are also a great sinner, said Kieran, putting his arms around her and kissing her. Then he looked intently into her eyes, which were burning with a passion he did not know, and said, Pride in you is overflowing, and this is a great sin. But I love you. I love you. Since when are you such a believer? Grace asked quietly. Well, it's all right. It's the way it should be. Different poles attract. You and I are so different. I'm the devil by your standards. You're an angel. And we're drawn to each other. That's love, Kieran, Grace whispered in his ear, her voice husky. He recognized that intonation when her voice became unreal, with an altered timbre. It meant she was aroused and wanted him. I love you like this. Yes, darling, yes, Grace whispered. That's what love is, and love justifies everything. Grace had everything she wanted: a marriage proposal, a party, a ring, a noisy company, a video shoot, and even fireworks. And most importantly, she saw the envy in her friend's eyes, unconcealed envy. And from that, as she thought, the holiday was a success. This is how she will go through life, so that everyone envies her and burst from this envy. And Kieran, although he has his own opinion, Grace knows how to tame him and direct him in the right direction. In spite of everyone, she will be happy, and she and Kieran will have everything they want. They just have to want it badly enough. The wedding of Kieran and Grace also thundered on a large scale, accompanied by noisy fun and videotaping. Afterwards, they visited Turkey, realizing their wish at her behest. Such noisy festivities were not in keeping with Kieran's character. He was very tired. Very tired. Even a vacation in Turkey had not done him any good. He was glad it was time to go to work. Grace's energy kept him on his toes. Maybe those who live together before marriage are right. At least they could figure out if they could live together. Or were they so different that living together was impossible? Kieran loved Grace very much, so he could not propose an unofficial marriage to her. He felt he would humiliate her with this proposal. He thought Grace deserved to be a real, legal wife. So a little old-fashioned, or rather, not modern at all, was Kieran. And all because of the way he'd been brought up. Both grandmother and mom and dad were educated, cultured people and always resented the relationship between a guy and a girl like try to live together, and then already in register marriage. Mother, and especially grandmother, could not understand how these cohabitants had already had 2 children, and still could not make up their minds whether to get married or to try further. That's why such relationships were taboo for Kieran. But now, yes, he's very tired of Grace. I think with the money we have left after the vacation, we should make some cosmetic repairs in the house, said Kieran, when he and Grace moved into the house of his grandmother. Not at all, Grace replied emphatically. I don't see the point of such an investment. We should build the new house we want behind this house. And then this one should be demolished, Kieran grinned. Who are we? Do you know how much money is needed for such a dream? We don't have that much money. And we don't know if we will have it. We need more than the crumbs we have left from the gift money to start building. It starts small, Grace said confidently. We'll get a loan from the bank and we'll build. Not invest in this old place, but build a house from scratch that will really be ours. Unrealistic, said Kieran. I don't earn enough to get into bank debt. They'll find you another job. We'll cover the loan with our main salary and live on our part-time jobs. And your salary? It won't be part of our family budget? Kieran asked. Well, Kieran, how could you ask me that? I didn't expect that from you. Grace laughed, switching to a joking tone. I am a woman. I have my own needs. I need money for them too. So my salary will be used for those proverbial pins. And then the house and the lot are yours alone. What's the point of me investing in it? We'll build the house together. What if I get thrown overboard? Grace, what are you thinking? We just got married. What about me? It's life, Kieran. Life and realities. And unfortunately, that's what they are. When you get divorced, you take what's yours. But I didn't get married to get divorced. Grace, listen to me. We don't need a new house. We can fix this one up. And 4 rooms, stone walls. It'll last us a lifetime. You're talking like an old man for our lifetime. Kieran, we live in a different century with all the benefits and innovations. Why should we live in the old way? Don't you realize how great it is to live in a smart house where everything is automated? Come on, Kieran, don't be shy. You're a man. And as you know, a man should build a house, raise a son, and plant a tree. I'll help you with the son and the tree, and you build a house. Be a man, said Grace. Let's not put off finding a job for you. I'll get right on it. You see how strong my ambition is. I'm willing to help you in any way I can, to support you. You can count on me. Tomorrow we'll go to the bank and find out what's going on. I've sketched the house. Look. Look at this. Look at the gorgeous house we're going to have. Grace opened her laptop, called Kieran, and, smiling in anticipation of surprising her husband, said, Come on, come here, look. There's too much information, there's too much of everything, and there's too much of you, Kieran wanted to say. And we won't go to the bank tomorrow. We've got to think about it. While you're thinking, the dollar will rise. You've got to think fast. This is the age of quick decisions. The bolder, the better. Or, if I understand correctly, are you going to live in this barn for the rest of your life? No, Kieran, I don't believe I was wrong about you. You're smart, you're determined, and you're a man. That's how I saw you when I married you. Come here, come here. Kieran reluctantly walked over to his wife and sat down beside her. He was looking at his laptop, listening, but he couldn't hear Grace. He was tired, very tired. Son, are you all right? Ciaran was asked by Ciara's mom. I look at you, you are not like the newlyweds, frowning, tired. Things not going well with you and Grace. I'm fine, Mom. I'm just really tired. I've been working a lot. You know, Grace and I are going to build a new house. I've been working part-time, telecommuting. Honestly, I'm not getting enough sleep. Kieran, would you say I'm meddling? But son, you've got to understand, your health is more important than a new house. You'll have a house, but your health will be gone forever. Sick people are not happy about anything, not even new houses. It's your decision to build a house. It's my and Grace's decision, Kieran replied. My boy Ciara hugged her son and stroked his shoulder. If you can't afford to build a house, you shouldn't tear yourself up like that. Sick, tired husbands are not necessary for people like Grace. Kieran answered his mother sharply. Don't. I don't want to hear it. Don't say anything bad about Grace to me. She is my wife. Ciara sighed. A wife takes care of her husband, not pulls the life out of him. I can see everything, son. I have eyes and ears. You've been too hasty with Grace, son. She needs another man, a man like her. Why did you raise me like this? Kieran asked, and putting his arms around his mother's neck like a child, he cried. I'm weak, mother, weak. No, Kieran, you're not weak. The mother stroked her son's head. You're not a pushover. You're not a bore or a scoundrel or a peddler. I don't know. Maybe in this day and age that's a disadvantage rather than an advantage. Your father and I raised you to be a decent man, and we're proud of you. And Grace needs a man with qualities that you don't have. A man who will go over your head and do whatever it takes to get what he wants. If you want to build the house Grace is claiming with your hard-earned money, you're going to kill yourself, son. Mom, but I love Grace. She's pregnant. We're having a baby, and I promised her this house. I can't not keep my word. This is where I regret raising you to be a man of your word. Can't you build a smaller house? Grace designed it herself, shows it off to everyone, brags about it, and that's why you can't back down. Ciara sighed heavily and said, I have a serious talk for you, son. Come on, I'll feed you. We can talk about it. Mom, thanks, I'm not hungry. No, Kieran, you've lost weight. What's wrong with that? Come on. Ciara took her son under her arm and they went into the kitchen. It's delicious as always, Kieran smiled after the meal. Now we'll talk. You think better on a full stomach, smiled his mother. Have you taken a loan from the bank yet? No, not yet. We're going this week. Grace and Kieran sat in the kitchen with Ciara. Granny's got some money too, said Ciara. We can lend it to you on your own recognizance. When you can, and if you can pay it back. Then why the receipt? Don't you trust me, mother? Kieran was surprised. The receipt. Let it be a document for Grace. I know how unpredictable she is. I told you not to speak ill of Grace, Kieran frowned. Did I say anything bad? You're just in the wrong sled. Son, Ciara sighed. Oh, Kieran, it's great that we don't have to go to the bank, Grace said brightly. Listen, since we have money to build a house, why don't we buy me a car on credit? Why? Do you have a second job? We can afford it. My belly's gonna grow soon. Where will I go with it on the shuttle buses? And then the baby comes, how am I supposed to carry it? Wait, Grace. Kieran stopped her. The money for the house came with conditions. What conditions? Grace asked unhappily. Well, for one thing, it's a loan. Here's a receipt notarized by a notary. And secondly, on the condition that I'll work only at my main job, I'll give up my part-time job. And we won't say you're moonlighting, Grace smiled conspiratorially. But if we don't, who's going to know? Grace, honey, I want a car so badly. I can't even imagine driving to work. Everyone would be jealous, she laughed. I'm not buying you a car. I feel sorry for people. Don't let anyone die. Let them live. Kieran tried to turn the conversation into a joking mode. Kieran, please, please. A car for a woman is a necessity, Grace whimpered. Grace. I don't know if it's jealousy or work that's going to kill me. Is that what you want? Kieran answered his wife seriously. Can't you see I'm having a hard time? I sleep for 3 hours, I get up at 6, and then the money is on loan. I have to pay it back from every paycheck. I'll cover the debt. What do you mean, on credit? They're your parents. Won't they forgive you for this money? They gave us all their money, Grace persisted. Do you understand that? Kieran asked. Do you really think I'd leave my parents without money? I don't know, Grace shrugged. Other parents forgive. And then they won't even have time to save for retirement. They're past their youth. They don't have a lot of wishes. They could have sacrificed that much money for their own son. Grace smiled and pouted like a child. Do you really want your wife to work her ass off on the buses? Mom was right, Kieran thought. That's why she had the debt notarized. Grace's needs not everyone can handle. Look, Grace, ask your parents for money for a car. Kieran dared to say. His wife's demands were starting to piss him off. I'll tell you right away, I'll give up my part-time job. Don't even think about it. I'm not able to work nights. Do you hear yourself? Grace was indignant. I have a husband, and I'm going to beg my parents for money for a car. Kieran, have you humiliated yourself like this? Kieran was silent. He realized that no matter what he said, Grace would have only her own opinion, and it was the right one. I'll quit my second job, I'll pay off my parents' debt, I'll keep building the house. I'm not counting on a car. And that's my final answer, Kieran reported to his wife. And now I have to sleep, and how do you want to sleep? How can you talk to me like that? I'm pregnant, and you're getting on my nerves. Grace burst into tears. Who's getting on whose nerves? Stop crying, kitten. Kieran hugged his wife. Let's go to bed, and you think about what I'm asking of you. Wine? A car is a necessity for a woman and not a whim. A lot of promises that you'll think about it. Don't get your hopes up. You know I keep my word, and I'm keeping it this time, Grace persisted. She realized that after going to her parents' house, Kieran had become so uncooperative. His mommy must have told him that. No, now they would go to Kieran's parents together. Grace thought, I must shield him from the influence of parental discipleship. I'm a wife now, and I'm the only one who should influence my husband. And the parents have finished their mission of education, and Kieran is not a boy to be danced to. He's a man who has to support and care for his family. I'll give my mother-in-law my opinion. She wouldn't dare come between me and Kieran. A man should have one woman to guide him through life. Mother's time is over. It's me now, Grace, Kieran's life guide. Kieran, darling, I love you so much. You realize that love isn't given to everyone, only to the chosen few. Your God must love you because I have you here with me. No one will ever love you like that. No one ever will. Embracing her husband, Grace whispered, I promised you a son. And now I've kept my promise. We already have one. All that's left is for him to be born. Can you imagine? Our favorite son. Kieran was happy with Grace being ever so slightly enthusiastic, but demanding nothing from him. They lay, they talked, they kissed. They loved each other. And in this moment there was no talk of the house, of how Grace would put it up, of how far her dreams had come, and how she was going to work hard to make those. And for Kieran, unrealistic, dreams come true in their lives. He was grateful to her for these rare moments of respite from material things, because it was in these moments that he was truly happy. The rest of the time he was tired of Grace's bursting energy, of her plans, which were gaining momentum, demanding unrealistic investments. And then after that incident, Kieran realized that if she was up to something, she would achieve it by any means necessary. All means are good for her desires. That incident shocked him, and he realized that there would be many such cases and he should be ready for them. Do you love me? Grace put her arms around her husband and pressed herself against him. Oh, do you hear our Vincent beating? We've heard it already, she said to the fetus, tapping his belly. Not yet, Grace. I've asked you 100 times not to address the unborn child by name. Do you ever listen to me? Even though I forget. Oh, don't be angry. Won't you do me this little favor? My motherly whim. You're so angry that I'm afraid to admit to you my little wish. What else? Kieran asked unhappily. I hope it's not a dream of a yacht. Oh, I'll be braver now. Because what I have acquired is such a trifle compared to a yacht. Kieran looked at her fearfully. Come on. I'll show you my little girl. Grace took her husband's hand and led him out of the gate. A red car was parked outside their house. How was it? It's a lot cheaper than a yacht, Kitty. Honey, I'm so happy. Even though I'm on maternity leave, I'll drive my baby to work tomorrow. They're gonna die of jealousy. Can you imagine their faces? Grace talked and talked, and he couldn't hear her words out of shock. Just a high, skinny voice, like a pesky fly. Come on, I'll show you. You'll see how great it is, Grace chirped and tugged Kieran's hand. You've already taken me for a ride, Kieran said, emphasizing the word already. He pulled his hand out of his wife's and asked what money was used to buy this baby. He had never spoken so rudely to Grace before, but here he could not bear it. He couldn't help himself. Are you out of your mind? We're building a house. I was against the car. Why don't you listen to me? You only hear yourself. Sometimes I think you're insane. Grace's eyes filled with tears and she threw a violent tantrum. Kieran didn't want to see the tantrum and thus encourage it. He did not rush to comfort her. He turned around and went home. He waited for her to show up, but she wasn't. Kieran got worried and went outside. Neither Grace nor the car was there. Where was she? Where had she gone? The distraught pregnant woman got behind the wheel and sped off. Where would he look for her? He called her cell phone. The calls came in, but she didn't answer. His head split in two with worry. He began to get headaches very often. It had never happened before. But once he got married, it became a frequent occurrence. Kieran went into the house, took his medicine, made another call, and heard Grace's cell phone in her bag lying on the couch. He called Grace's parents, but she wasn't there, and her friends didn't have her either. She got home late, close to midnight, and as if nothing had happened, she rattled on. Kotik. You can't imagine how everyone sighed with envy when they saw my little girl. I'm in a wonderful mood, even though you're mad at me. No one's going to ruin my happiness. So Kitty, no need to get upset and get on each other's nerves. It's done. Kieran was silent. He was so nervous that his headache wouldn't let go. You feel good when others feel bad. Vampire was all Kieran could say. Yes, I'm your little vampire, Grace adopted a playful tone. And now I'm going to bite you, and then I'm going to kiss you. She threw herself around Kieran's neck, but he pulled her away from him. I can't see you. I can't. Go away nicely. Where would I go, Kieran? I'm your wife. And as you know, husband and wife are the same Satan. And then we'll have a son. Satan is you, Kieran said. I'm beginning to realize that we've rushed into marriage. You and I are different, you know. I think I'll have to put up with you and your delusions all my life. I'm getting a headache. I'm sorry, Kieran, Grace cried. I know it must be hard for you, but it's only at first. It's like that for everyone, until you get used to each other. And then they get used to it and become one. Understand, my dear man. Love is not for everyone. And I love you so much. I can't do it without you. I can't. Where did you get the money for the car? Kieran interrupted Grace's passionate speech. I'm talking about love, you're talking about money. So which one of us is the mercenary? I asked you a question. How hard is it to answer without all the waterworks? Just answer. I bought it on credit. I made the down payment with the money you were saving for your parents. Grace stopped talking. I suppose you'd better not know where the money is, said Kieran. You'll be on maternity leave with the baby. How are you going to pay off the loan? It's not that much money, though. The car isn't cheap. I think we'll be able to pay it off in no time. Who's we? IA. Grace grinned. We were plowing, said the fly that sat on the ox's horns. Well, you're the fly, the annoying fly that's bothering me, and I want to swat it in one fell swoop to be free of it. Don't do that, Kieran stopped himself. I promise it won't happen again. Believe me, we'll have a child, your son and mine. We'll have a new home. Imagine how happy we'll be. We'll come to each other. You'll see how great it will be. Now, if he had any money, Kieran kept it only on his card. The PIN number, known only to him, was unknown to Grace. He knew it was dangerous to keep money in the house without consulting him. Grace instantly found a use for it. For a time, Grace ceased her frenetic activity about the ideas and prospects she was creating for her husband. A child was born in Los Angeles, and she was fully immersed in motherhood, which pleased Kieran very much. Grace was probably right. Kieran thought it would take time for them to get used to each other. 6 months had passed since the birth of baby Vader, and Grace had resumed her efforts in the area of perfecting her family. She realized that their house was being built, and it was her credit. She had insisted on such a beautiful, comfortable, modern home. She had bought herself a car, it is true, against Kieran's wishes, but how comfortable she is now. And then it was her dream come true, too. Kieran took a break from her ideas. Time to get back into work, Grace thought. Otherwise, if her husband isn't pushed to exploits, the mire of a frustrated bog awaits him. There needs to be movement. Movement is life. I will not let Kieran die in this quagmire. I will push him forward, encourage him. We'll get to such heights, everyone will gasp and die of envy. Kieran, have you thought about changing jobs? Grace asked. You can't stay in the same rut with a steady paycheck. I think a man needs development, to move up, to feel on top of things. Somehow, Kieran, you've accepted your average salary, your status as a manager. If you see that the job is unpromising, is it worth holding on to it? I see your potential and I think you're capable of more. I'm happy with the job, Kieran replied. And then Grace. It's not easy to find a high-paying job in this town. This isn't Los Angeles. The rates are different here. And I think I have a pretty good job and the pay is pretty good. Not bad, Grace repeated as if tasting the word. She was silent for a moment, as if giving Kieran time to consider the term. And then she said not bad means nothing. Kieran, you're 31 years old, and you have a pretty good job with a pretty good salary. And at the moment you have a lot of debt, and you're willing to put up with it. Is that how I see it? What do you want from me? Kieran sighed. I'll tell you right away, I won't be able to work nights. I've been having these headaches lately. I'm not happy about the white light, so I realize that night work won't do me any good. Who said anything about night work? Grace was outraged. I'm talking about changing jobs. You know what I mean, Kieran? You know it's impossible to get a high-paying job without connections. And you can count on me. You want me to find you a job like that. But where would you find it? Grace, don't be ridiculous on the internet. Kieran grinned. No, not like that, she said. I'm not stupid enough to look for a prestigious job on the internet. I still have some connections from the past. I can build bridges and try to find you something more worthy of your intelligence and your knowledge. How would you feel about that? Grace, did you have such a past? Kieran wondered. Were you what? Am I jealous of your past? Grace laughed. Well, that's silly. Didn't you have one before me? And then I worked for this big company and I was in good standing. That's all it was. Why did you leave such a great company? I'm afraid you wouldn't believe it, Grace hesitated, or you'd take it the wrong way, so I'd rather not talk about it. But I'd like to know what pitfalls to expect if you're going to put me in there. Okay, Grace sighed. Just promise not to jump to conclusions. Listen. My boss's wife was jealous of me for him, but not of the boss himself, but of the head of the department I worked in. That's funny, Kieran snorted. But you couldn't prove your innocence? I wasn't going to prove it, it's beyond me, Grace said. I just quit, that's all. And you want people to say behind my back that I'm the husband of the woman who was having an affair with the boss. I knew it, Grace said sharply. I didn't, and haven't been hooking up with anyone. And you're a man. Are you afraid of some idle gossip? It's ridiculous. Kieran, if you're a man, you should be afraid of small wages, low ranks, and poverty, not gossip. We have a son growing up. He needs a good kindergarten, not a bunch of snotty kids where he'll always be sick, but a real elite one. Then you are not going to give him to a simple high school, where they raise drug addicts and alcoholics for the future of the country. Grace kept coming at him. The kid should be in a school with good kids from good families, not with the rabble where he's going to become the same rabble. Grace, you're making it worse, Kieran objected. I went to high school and, as you can see, I didn't become a rabble. Don't compare, Grace said. It's a different time. The worthy join the worthy. And the trash? She didn't finish. She stood up abruptly and went into the other room. Then she stopped at the door, turned around and said, think about all this at your leisure. In a word, I'm right. And you know it. When you've thought it over, you'll say. The dream house was built, and Kieran's family moved in. Kieran, it's time to tear down that shed that's such an eyesore, Grace said. We'll plant roses and weed the lawn and all that. I'll go out to the kitchen in the morning and look at the beauty of it. It'll make me thirsty. This shed prevents me from realizing my plans to transform the landscape around the house. It's going to take a lot of money to demolish the house. And your landscape, too, Kieran shook his head. So my solution is not to demolish the house, but to renovate it with the money that would have gone into demolishing it. I can't demolish the house my grandparents built. You're crazy. Grace gasped. You've made up your mind? Did you ask me? Do you ask me when you've made up your mind? Was the wedding according to your plan? Did you plan the vacation? Did you design the house? I bought the car on my own. Did you ask me? Are you going to do this for the rest of your life? I'm going to have this barn and this car in my face. Grace was torn up with emotion. I wanted what was best. I wanted our child to walk and play on the lawn, not bump into that shed. Shut up. Kieran couldn't help himself. And don't call the house where my parents were born a barn. There's no telling how things will turn out. Maybe someone else will have to live in this house. I could use the extra room. It would prevent me from being completely happy. Grace took a breath. I didn't envision our home that way, and this shed is a hindrance to that. Kieran glanced at his wife, and she stopped talking. And you know, Kieran, people will come to the housewarming party and be surprised by this wreck in the middle of the yard. The old house steals the impression of the new. I don't think anyone's going to be jealous to see that wretched thing in the yard. It's a good thing they won't. They'll sleep better. Kieran interrupted her rudely. You don't think they will this time? Accept it. And even your tears won't make me back down. After the quarrel, Grace did not speak to her husband for a week. She hoped to get what she wanted by keeping quiet. But she realized Kieran wasn't that simple. Once he'd said something, he was unlikely to change his mind. But that's all right, she'll get her way in other ways. Grace, as a hostess, was proud of her brainchild and showed the guests the possibilities of the smart house. Despite the old house in the backyard, everyone admired the new home. But she didn't invite guests just to show off. She had her own plans for them. She decided to tear down the old house with their hands to get their support. Well, it certainly worked out the way Kieran and I wanted it to, Grace said at the party table. But Kieran doesn't want to tear down the old house. He thinks it's appropriate here. Personally, I don't think so. So I'd like to get some outside opinions. Do you think there's a need for an old hut next to this magnificent house? Hearing such unpleasant words about her house, Grandma was saddened. She lowered her head and smoothed the folds of her skirt. She cried furtively, quickly wiping away her tears with her handkerchief so no one would notice. Kieran's mother put her arms around his grandmother and pulled her close. Kieran saw all of this. He was ashamed of his wife's words in front of his grandmother and in front of his parents. Of course, a lot of people had come to the housewarming party, and he didn't want to find out about it. He didn't want to spoil the holiday for those who came to enjoy their new home and have fun. I wouldn't tear the house down either, said Ivan, Kieran's friend. I would renovate it, make it into an extra living space. No one could use the extra living space. On the contrary, many at the table supported Ivan, which upset Grace very much. She realized she had lost this time. If it weren't for my parents and my grandmother, this house wouldn't exist, said Kieran. Let's drink to their health, he said to the guests. My loved ones, my dear ones, thank you for everything. Kieran went to his mother, father, and grandmother and kissed them. What about me? Don't I get a thank you? Grace said resentfully. If it wasn't for me. Of course, everyone heard the indignation of the mistress of the house, but realized that it was not worth focusing on her offended words. Everyone supported the toast. The guests made praised toasts in honor of the hosts. The guests cheered, and Grace did not feel her triumph. She was not envious of the people who had come to the housewarming party. They just shared the joy, cheered, and for some reason praised Kieran and his parents, but not her. She was the one who had built the house thanks to her kicking, and his parents' money had been given not for nothing, but as a loan. Why were you pouting all evening? Kieran asked his wife. Well, it's not proper to invite people and sit like a mouse on the croup. He hugged her, kissed her on the temple. My little mouse, look, you'll burst. Kieran wanted to cheer up his wife. So all smart and clever, all honored, all participants in the construction of the house, I'm the only one on the side. Grace was indignant. And why didn't you say that your beloved grandmother, Daddy and Mommy gave you the money on credit? Why did you sing such dithyrambs to them? Didn't you know that? If we had borrowed the money from the bank, the interest would have cost us another house, Kieran explained. Grace, you know all about that. And then my parents forgave me half of the money and gave it to my grandmother to rebuild the house. Oh, so that's it. I'm nobody here, and my name is nobody. And that's the last I'll know, Grace said, indignantly. I only found out about it today. My dad told me about it, that it was their housewarming gift to us. Kieran changed his tone. Grace, well, since we don't have to pay off the debt, let's hire a housekeeper. Look how big the house is, how much cleaning there is, especially today after the guests so many dishes to wash. You have a dishwasher, said Kieran. But you have to get the dishes ready before it. I don't think I can do it alone. Why did you have to build such a big house? Convenience, Grace said sharply. Convenience. What's the point of hiring a housekeeper? And then you haven't even gone to work yet. Can't you handle it? Of course I can't. There's house after house after house, and that old house of yours. I'm prioritizing the baby. I told you I could call you about a job that pays twice your salary. A good one. You don't say anything, so you're okay with the pittance you get. And we have to suffer because our breadwinner is happy with a good salary. I get it, said Kieran. Because no one was jealous of you today, you decided to take out your anger on me. You know what I'll tell you? This house was built because I loved you, and I promised it to you. Or rather, you made me promise you. I was building it. And I already knew it then. We didn't understand each other, and we never will. No matter what kind of house we live in, happiness doesn't depend on the wall. Honestly, I hate this house. Everything revolves around it. Where are we? Grace? Where are we? Is the house more important than our feelings? With this house and your crazy ideas, we've lost everything we had. 4 years we lived with you. We built a house, and that's it. We have no common ground, Grace sighed. So while we were building the house, we had something in common, and now we don't. Isn't our baby Vincent a common ground? Grace, we dreamed of this house. We dreamed of how happy we'd be to live in it, Kieran said. You were the one who dreamed of it. I was just the doer. I don't want to stay in this house. I have a terrible headache from your arguments, your frustrations, and your irritation. I'm going to sleep at Grandma's house. Is that what you're going to keep it for? To run away from me? Kieran didn't respond to his wife's words, only shut the door tightly behind him. Grace went into the kitchen. She didn't want to look out of the windows at that hut on chicken legs. For the first time in their 4 years together, Kieran had not slept with her, had defiantly gone to that hovel she hated. No, she doesn't want that kind of strife. First, he will not lie in the marital bed. Then he will find himself a mistress. And then, perhaps, will wish to divorce her. That's something she can't let happen. She can't find a man like Kieran. She's not so stupid, she realizes that. Besides, where would she go in the event of a divorce? Her parents? No. By any means necessary, she'll still be the mistress of this magnificent house. Kieran's not exactly a star in the sky, but he does his best for his family. And that's the kind of husband you'll find. And then a father is better than a stepfather for her child. Kieran loves Vincent very much, but you can't play on his love for a child for long. You've got to be more subtle. Kieran didn't go into the new house. Grace watched from the window as he left for work, and for the first time they didn't have breakfast together, so he's still angry with her. And by the looks of it, there'd be more fighting tonight. She had to get the house in order, cook something nice for dinner after the guests, and be sure to have candles to make it intimate and romantic. Grace decided that she needed to clean herself up too, so that Kieran could see who he was trying to make a deal with. What's a wife like her to look for? And the fact that she was pushing him to some small victories, so it was again only a plus for her. Without her initiative, they would live in this shack with paper wallpaper. Grace didn't like the fact that Kieran was stubborn, unwilling to take the high-paying job. She'd already made inquiries, got her ex-lover involved. There's a place, but they won't wait long. We need to get Kieran and push him into a position that would bring them good money. Of course, the work there is nervous. The state constantly allocates money for government contracts, so there are frequent inspections, audits, where auditors pick on every comma. Not everyone can withstand such nervous tension. Despite high salaries, people often quit. That's why it's possible to get Kieran a job there. Kieran, don't do that again. I was up all night. I'm used to having you with me at night. I was scared. I wanted to call you, but I was afraid you'd start fighting with me again. I know you're tired. The guest had been drinking, so he got a little hasty. Maybe I'm wrong about something, but you're wrong too, honey. No matter how much we fight, we should sleep together. I didn't sleep all night either, said Kieran. And I was scared about the way we were living, you know. I thought about it for a long time, and I realized that you and I are not a couple. We're so different sometimes it's impossible. You only think about material things. I don't deny that our world is real. And it takes money. But I can't give you as much money as you want. You'd better find another man to encourage your ideas. I'm willing to give you your freedom. Let's get a divorce. I can't take it anymore, you know. I can't. Don't you love me anymore? Grace immediately burst into tears. Baby, how could I be without you? How could Vincent be without you? Do you really want your son to be raised by someone else's uncle? When the most difficult part of our life is over, do you suddenly think about it, Kieran? Grace sat down next to her husband and put her arms around him. Look at me, look at me. Can't you see how much I love you? No, I can't have a divorce. And I don't want any other man. You may not believe me, but I can't live without you, and I don't want to live without you. Do you really want our baby to be without a mother? What do you mean motherless? Kieran didn't understand. Will you leave Vincent with me in the divorce? I don't mind. I don't mind at all. Mom and Grandma will help me raise him. What's Granny and Mommy got to do with it? Of course, when I'm gone, they can help you. You misunderstand me, Kieran. If you leave me, I'll kill myself. And it's not just words or threats. If you want to know the truth of my promises, divorce me, and you'll find out how you'll live with it, Kieran. And what will you tell your son when he grows up and asks you why I did it? It's blackmail. That's all I need. I didn't think you were capable of that. I'm not. It's not blackmail, Kieran, it's love. I can't imagine life without you. That's the truth. Don't drive me away, my love. Grace sobbed. Let me stay by your side and let me love you. Is that too much to ask? Kieran realized that the whole thing seemed like a cheap candlelight performance. But knowing Grace's mobile psyche, where tears for no reason at all, where tears could turn into laughter in a minute, what the hell, maybe her suicide threats weren't so unfounded. If that happens, he really won't forgive himself. He was so tired of it all. Kieran realized that he had been up all night and had a terrible headache. I want to sleep, he said. I have a headache. Where are the medicines? I don't know where they are in this house yet. Peace. Sweet peace. Grace looked into her husband's eyes and said, You're going to see how great things are going to be with you and me. You won't regret that we didn't get divorced. I said, I have a headache. Give me a pill. This time there was no danger of divorce. Grace saw that Kieran was determined to break up, but fell for her threat to kill herself. So he was scared. And that's good for her. She'll know how to manipulate her husband. It's time for Grace to come back to work from maternity leave. So she decides to use one more trick on her husband. She's going to try to squeeze him after all. He'll take the job she got him. Although, I'm not going back to my old job. I quit. What's wrong with your job? No new people to envy you, Kieran grinned. I know you meant it as a joke, to poke fun at me. But it's not about envy. Someone in our family has to earn money if you won't take that responsibility. I have to provide for my family. I'll get a job, I can hire a housekeeper. I won't have time to take care of the house. I have to put the baby in a high-end daycare center. I'm not putting Vincent in a breeding ground for infections. And I need money for that too. Did you get a job like that? Where do they pay the money you're going to use to do all this? Kieran asked with a grin. Yes, I did, Grace replied calmly. That's where you don't want to go. I'll go to my lover, Kieran said angrily. Why your lover? I explained the situation to you. No one there was my lover. And then I am a married woman. What claims can there be against me? I have a family, a child. I put that above all gossip. That's when I took offense and left. And now I have grown out of these petty grudges so I can go to work there again. Grace continued. But I'll tell you right away, it's hard work. And no one gets paid money for nothing. Sometimes, and on weekends are loaded. Sometimes you have to work late, irregular working hours. In short, it's all spelled out in the labor contract. I tell you about all this at once, so that then there were no claims against me. Why did you decide this on your own? And you're just putting me on the spot. It's a family matter, so we have to decide it together, Kieran answered calmly. We are, Grace replied. But you've left me no choice. Someone has to take financial responsibility for the family. Is this your way of pushing me into this job? Is that what I'm offering you right now? I realize it's not your thing. It's useless to hold you accountable. So I'll go myself. Well, go, said Kieran. When you go out, most likely in a week you have to quit your old job, and then. Kieran didn't talk about the subject again. And Grace had said all she wanted to say. She hadn't expected Kieran to say that. She'd have to do the work herself. If she gave up the idea, Kieran would realize that it was just scaremongering, manipulation. So he won't take her threats seriously. She would not want to meet with those who witnessed that shameful scandal when the wife of her lover came straight to the department, grabbed her by the hair, and hit her head against the table where she was sitting. She hit it with such force that a lump formed on her forehead and her nose bled. "If I ever see you at this table again," said the scandalized woman, "I will beat your bad head against the table until this table falls apart." Such shame and such scandal. Grace didn't know where to put her eyes from the gloating of those around her, so she couldn't take it anymore and quit. Now would she have to see all those faces again? Grace heard that Kieran had learned all the tricks. I guess this conversation had touched him after all. He was thinking, after all, she was glad of her husband's concern. It means she's not hopeless and she's on the right track. "Kieran, darling, can I give you a lift to work today?" Grace said at breakfast. "We'll go to my old job. I have to hand in my resignation letter. We'd better hurry. A good job won't wait long. As soon as it's available, it'll be taken. So take advantage of my kindness." Grace smiled and poked Kieran on the cheek. "I'll make it quick. You won't be late?" "Don't worry." "Wait, Grace, before you quit." Grace looked at her husband questioningly. "Can you wait for 2 days?" Kieran asked. "Why?" "I don't get it, Grace." "Wait for what, Kieran?" "To wait for the seat I'm counting on to be filled. Miss out and regret it." "No, Kieran, I can't take that risk. Eugene promised me a spot. Maybe it'll work out. And if it doesn't, Eugene won't help me, and I'll lose the job." "No, Kieran. They gave me a week to do everything. That place Eugene's promising, is the pay really good?" Grace asked with doubt in her voice. "Yes, it's good, 1.5 times my salary. But it'll have to wait. But if Eugene doesn't work out, then I'll take that job of yours. You're afraid of gossip. What if Eugene doesn't work out? And you don't think I'll have time to register?" "I can't take that risk, Kieran. It's not every day you get a job like this. I give you my word, I'll go if it doesn't work out with Eugene. If Grace, you know, if I've given my word, it's my word. It's my word. So you don't have to worry. Vincent's going to have a high-end daycare center." "Thank you, darling." Grace rushed over to kiss Kieran. "Once again, I was convinced I'd chosen the right husband. How lucky I am to have you. Right here, Kieran. It scares me when people envy me what a wonderful husband I have." Grace was afraid of jinxing the situation. Knowing Kieran, she still hoped that he would take financial responsibility for the family. Would he really be satisfied with a salary less than hers? Grace would certainly be happy for Eugene to find Kieran a job. According to Kieran, the pay there is even higher than what Grace was promised. And then there's no malcontents there who'd want to tell Kieran the truth. "I don't care about them, let them talk." She'd get out of it. Kieran would believe her, not these envious people who did nothing but envy her. Eugene couldn't get a job for Kieran, so having given his word to his wife, Kieran had to go to work where Grace had gotten a bad name. He didn't realize that he would find out the details of his wife's liaisons with her boss and the other employees of that business so quickly. It wasn't that he'd been deliberately inquiring. It had all spilled out on its own. Kieran even liked the work interesting, promising. And he gave himself to it completely, for which he received a decent salary and even bonuses. No, of course, not immediately he found out about everything. He worked quietly until some personalities did not realize that he was the husband of the very Grace, who, seeking the best place for herself, jumped from one bed to another. It turns out that she boldly took advantage of men who promoted her career. And then she did not squander the attention of customers with whom she worked, and for the good of the company traveled to foreign resorts with these customers. It was a shock to Kieran. Who was he living with? A whore. That's why she's pulling his heart out. She's used to living the high life, and he, a simple guy, fell naively into the clutches of a predator. Grace had never seen Kieran so drunk. He couldn't speak a word. She could tell from his rambling speech that he'd found out. She didn't care what he'd been told. The next day, when Kieran sobered up, she would refute all these rumors and gossip. After all, who would he believe, her or those who had once envied her? Her, of course. She's his wife. And then there's the whole pre-marriage thing. As Kieran's wife, she never cheated on him. She just didn't have time for it. She molded her husband into the kind of man she thought he should be. Coming home from work in such an inebriated state, Kieran spoke his mind as best he could and collapsed on the bed without undressing. Grace didn't take off his clothes out of principle. He'll wake up. He'll be ashamed of himself for stooping to this, she thought. Kieran was wheezing, and he stank of booze. So Grace retired from the bedroom to the living room couch. She couldn't sleep for a long time, preparing an exculpatory speech to her husband. And then she had to keep him from doing something rash, or God forbid, he would think of quitting. To the children's and youth sports school, she turned to her son. Set the table for breakfast. Go wake up Daddy. It's time to have breakfast and get ready for work. About 3 minutes later, Vincent returned with the words. Daddy doesn't want to get up. He's lying on the floor. I wake him up, but he won't get up. Well, I've got to go bow at his feet. Grace was angry. But she realized that anger was not her best counselor today. Today she must be patient, not to quarrel with her husband, but to convince him of her innocence. She must tell him he was right. Envious people are bad. That's what envy brings people to gossip. Nasty gossip, she decided. Walking into the bedroom, Grace said, Kieran, get up for work. It's time. Kieran was lying on the floor beside the bed. It was strange. He was lying on his back with his arms and legs spread. His face is very calm, his eyes are open, and it looks like he's... Kieran. Grace shouted and turned to her husband. From lack of money, Isabella got a job as a maid to a millionaire widower. And when she saw her own face in the photo... T4. Isabella Swan sat in the city park and cried bitterly. For the first time in her life, she was in a situation from which she saw no way out. After all, it seemed that not so long ago the girl was absolutely happy and dreamed of how soon she would get married and together with her beloved husband could create a real family. Unfortunately, Isabella's dreams were not destined to come true. On the contrary, the fairy tale quickly turned into a real nightmare for the young modest girl. Now, finding herself alone with the harsh reality, Bella was not only left completely alone without any support help, but could not even remotely imagine what awaits her in the foreseeable future. And it all started a few months ago when Isabella, having celebrated with her best friend her 23rd birthday, was returning home late at night from a nice cafe, recently opened in the neighborhood where Bella lived. Anne, a friend of the girl, offered to call a taxi for her, but Bella refused. They had already spent a lot of money in that fancy place. Isabella was strict about that. She tried to save on such things, allowing herself to arrange even such small holidays only on special occasions. Bella, let me call you a car after all. Anne insisted. Look at the clock, it's 11 o'clock. It's dangerous to walk in your neighborhood at this hour. Don't, she said with a smile. I've lived here for so many years, every dog knows me. What could happen here? And it's not that far. It's only a couple of blocks. If you're after money, I'll pay for your trip myself. You're stubborn, Anne said and started tapping something on her phone. I don't want anything to happen to you on your birthday, Bella. When she saw that her friend was about to leave the address for the taxi, Isabella gently covered the girl's hand with her own palm. Anne, she said in a quiet but insistent voice, don't. It's just a waste of money. Let's not try your Ben's patience. Her friend's eyebrows went up in surprise. What does Ben have to do with this? That's why he gives me the money, so I can have a good time with my friends. He's generous and understanding. Anne laughed, remembering her fiancé. He worked for a large construction company and was paid more than enough to fulfill the every whim of his charming. though sometimes a little capricious bride. I know that. And that's why I'm asking you again, don't call anyone. I'll walk myself. Let's call again tomorrow. With these words, Bella kissed her best friend on the cheek and strolled leisurely towards her house, enjoying the warm spring air on the way. When the girl's house was only a couple of 100 meters away, a large sports car suddenly pulled up beside her. The window of the driver's seat slid down, and a young man, whose face was dotted with small scars and pimple marks, looked unpleasant in appearance. "Beauty, why are you walking alone? Are you bored? Don't you want to have a good time with me and my friends?" The guy tried to simultaneously smile languidly and shout over the loud music playing in his car. The result was a pathetic picture. "No, thank you," Bella replied briefly, trying not to look at the unpleasant major. "What do you mean, no?" He was surprised and turned to someone who sat in the passenger seat. "Have you heard, men? This girl refuses to keep us company." "Well, wait." The car, which until that moment had been slowly following Isabella, finally stopped. Bella realized that things were worse than she had expected, and so she quickened her step. But at that moment she was blocked by 3 tall guys who jumped out of the sports car. "Where are you going, beautiful?" one of them asked. "You're doing wrong. You can't offend decent men like that. We came to you with an offer, and what are you doing, turning your face away from us?" Isabella boldly looked all 3 of them in the eye, giving them a disdainful look. "Who else would talk about decency here? I told you I don't want to go anywhere with you. Let me through now." "Or what?" one of them asked, smiling wryly, nudging his mate. "Or you'll complain to your boyfriend, or maybe to your husband. I don't see a ring on your ring finger, and a normal bloke wouldn't let you go out alone at a time like this. So don't be a wuss. Just get in the car." The girl choked with indignation, not immediately finding something to say to such a blatant insolence. "I'm going to call the police and scream," she finally managed to say. And at that moment Isabella felt the steel embrace of someone's cold arms close around her. She turned round and saw over her shoulder that she had been grabbed by a pimply-faced boy major. "Help!" Bella shouted as hard as she could, pushing the rest of the air out of her, but was instantly kicked in the throat by one of the muscular scoundrels. "Worry as much as you want, if you can," he grinned. "Nobody can hear you here anyway, and if they did, nobody would care. You know how our people are. If a girl screams in the courtyard in the middle of the night, it means she's a shallow fool who can't be calmed down by her boyfriend. Should we put her in the boot?" "No, it's not interesting that way," shook his head negatively, shook the head of the guy who was the most powerful physique. "Let's get her in the saloon, and me and the men will help you." The huge Ambo picked Isabella up by the legs, while the second opened the door and the third helped the major and his mate shove the girl into the car. "No, no, please don't. Help," Bella shouted. But she could only manage suppressed wheezes. Her stomach still ached from the impact, and her lungs felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of her lungs at once. Just as Isabella was about to say goodbye to her life, imagining in advance how it might end, police sirens suddenly sounded behind the company. Maybe a patrol car was passing by and heard me, the girl thought hopefully. "What's going on?" "Guys, the cops are coming. Let's go," shouted the leader of the thugs, and immediately his grip on Isabella's legs loosened. "Seriously, what are we going to do? Do we take her with us or not?" the major asked in horror. He, too, was confused and had not expected that anyone could see them in such an inconspicuous courtyard. "Leave her," shouted the head jock. "Anyway, she's a wretch, and we won't get any pleasure from her. Consider yourself lucky." Then Bella was roughly shoved out of the car, and the company of scoundrels fled in an unknown direction on their sports car. The girl's heart was beating as if ready to break through the chest and jump out. The unfortunate Isabella experienced such a powerful attack of fear that she was not immediately able to rise to her feet. Her hands and knees trembled and she gasped for air, but she felt like a fish thrown on the ice. For a second she clenched her eyes tightly, trying to calm down and stop shivering. And then someone on her right asked her sympathetically, "Girl, are you all right? Do you need any help? Should I call an ambulance?" Bella looked where the voice was coming from and saw a young man with glasses and a leather briefcase under his arm. He was looking at her with interest, while checking something on his phone. Intercepting her gaze, he explained. The sirens are just a ringtone sound, the guy explained. I saw that those bastards were going to take you away by force. So the only thing I could think of was to switch on the police siren. Where did you go? Isabella asked, looking around for the police. But of course she didn't see anyone. So no one is coming here then? I'm afraid not, the guy shrugged and leaned over Bella, holding out his hand to her. Let me help you up. Dazed, Isabella accepted the help, and the young man, gently holding her by the waist, helped her to the nearest bench, and then gently sat down. My name is Michael, he introduced himself. I'm sorry if I didn't stand up for you with my fists. It's just that I don't have the physical fitness to deal with 4 men at once, and I had to act fast. Bella looked at him with eyes full of tears and gratitude. What are you saying? On the contrary, I am incredibly grateful to you for your resourcefulness. You saved my life. If not for you, I could have been taken many kilometers away from here and probably killed. Isabella couldn't help crying in front of a stranger, the effects of stress. Nothing to be done about it. Please don't cry. Michael tried to calm her down. Would you like me to walk you home? I'm sure you live around here somewhere. Yes, thank you, she said, wiping away her tears. I'm sorry I'm not bothering you with this. You probably need to go home. You're off work. Bella nodded at his briefcase, but Michael smiled good-naturedly. Yes, my boss had to call me in on my own day off. As always, it was necessary to do something that could wait until Monday. The girl smiled back and gave him her hand. Isabella. It's a pleasure to meet you. As strange as it may sound, I'm very glad you were called into work today. The boy laughed and shook her hand. Me, too. Well, let's go. And they walked the remaining distance to the girl's house. On the way, they didn't talk about anything else. But just before they drove up, Michael asked Isabella for permission to meet with her again, to make sure that she had come to her senses. Sure. Let's meet at Main Street Ice Cream, Bella suggested. I love ice cream. Great. Michael responded and smiled a charming smile that gave Isabella butterflies in her stomach. It was surprising and pleasant at the same time. The girl decided that another meeting with this cultured guy would definitely do her no harm, especially since they seemed to like each other. That night, Isabella was not immediately able to sleep. Too many conflicting emotions raged inside her, paralyzing fear and humiliation from the scumbag story. But at the same time, deep in her heart, she felt a warm sympathy for Michael, who had saved her. He was like a knight on a white horse, only fighting not with a sword, but with his own wit and ingenuity. This turn of events excited Bella, and she looked forward to the next meeting with her new acquaintance. And she was eager to get to know him better. A couple of days later, at the appointed time, the guy and the girl met near the cafe. Michael looked great in his light blue light shirt and light linen trousers. A light beige jacket was elegantly thrown over his shoulders. Isabella was dressed as feminine as possible, a dress with a cherry blossom pattern, light sneaker shoes, and a soft ash pink shawl. The girl had arranged her blonde curls in a beautiful high hairdo, so that the image turned out to be very festive, though simple in execution. When they sat down at the table and the order was brought to them, the couple talked. Bella told the guy about herself and waited with interest for his reaction. She knew that she probably didn't look like any of the girls Michael knew. Fortunately, the guy's reaction was quite positive. I can't believe you're seriously working at a newsagent's? He asked with a slightly enthusiastic smile. Yes, I'm not kidding, Bella answered him cheerfully. I love selling people fresh newspapers and magazines. I can't help it. Isabella laughed. Michael looked at her with undisguised admiration. Then I have to tell you, with 100% responsibility, that you are the prettiest press saleswoman I have ever bought my favorite newspapers from. They both burst out laughing, and then continued their heart-to-heart conversation. Bella felt as if a stone had fallen from her soul. She was very worried that, having learned her place of work, Michael would not want to continue to communicate with her. But it turned out to be exactly the opposite. Well, I'm just an analyst for a financial company, Michael said, fixing his glasses on the bridge of his nose. My job is boring numbers, indicators, but it pays a lot more than teaching. Wait, I don't get it, the girl said. So you taught high school? In college. But not for long, Michael answered her. I soon realized that pedagogy was impossible without a true vocation, and so I decided to trade the walls of the student body for the stuffy office of an analyst. The guy sarcastically raised his eyebrows, letting the girl know that he did not regret his professional choice. And what about your family? How did they feel about your decision? Bella ventured to ask him about his loved ones. Isabella, Michael's face immediately took on a grim expression. I'm from the orphanage. I'm sorry, but I don't really want to talk about it. Do you understand? Bella nodded. I'm an orphan myself. My mom died 3 years ago. Unable to cope with oncology, we just didn't have the money for the expensive treatment the doctors insisted on. I miss her very much. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Her heart was filled with familiar pain and longing. She missed her mother terribly, though enough time had passed that, as they say, time had healed the wound. Michael shook her hand with feeling. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, looking her straight in the eye. Bella, you really are the most amazing girl I've ever met, so beautiful and so. What's that? With excitement in her voice, she asked him again. The boy was silent for a second, choosing words, then smiled. Human, simple, but in a good way, he hastened to add. You know, all the girls I know at work are like bright birds. Spectacular exterior, but inside there is an absolute emptiness. Sometimes it seems to me that they don't work for their careers, but for walking around in their new outfits every day in front of the whole office. Bella laughed. The bad thoughts instantly vanished like smoke. Michael portrayed his colleagues so funny that the girl could not hold back a sincere, good-natured laughter. After the cafe, she and Michael went for a walk along the seafront. From it opened just a superb view of the river. They talked for a long time, discussing all sorts of things with each other, what kind of literature they liked, who and what they liked in the cinema. Isabella, who had been working at the press kiosk for several years in a row, was a remarkably well-read girl. On her modest salary, she regularly bought the most popular novelties of modern literature. The girl had an excellent knowledge of English, German, and so-called Scandinavian prose, and she really had a lot to talk about and discuss. Michael and Bella had a lot in common, so the first date was followed by the second and the second by the third. Just a month after meeting, young people officially declared themselves a couple. The girl's work did not embarrass Michael at all, and he was happy to meet her in the evening after closing her small kiosk. Isabella, I've noticed that you get one of those good-looking guys every time you visit, her work partner, Mrs. Mary, told her. Is he your fiancé, suppose? No, not yet. Anyway, Isabella said, blushing to the roots of her hair. Mrs. Mary was a middle-aged woman who had worked at their kiosk recently, but Bella didn't like the way she sometimes looked at her. Mrs. Mary was definitely jealous of her youth and her desire to live, no matter what. While her partner herself had long ago become disillusioned with men and her own dreams of a better future. Watch carefully, Bella, she warned her partner. He's too sweet, not your fiancé. He could easily deceive you. You'll have a lot of tears to wash away. Isabella looked at Mrs. Mary in all seriousness and spoke clearly so that she could distinguish every word. Don't worry so, Mrs. Mary. I can manage my life and my men without your help. My private life has nothing to do with you. Mrs. Mary only grinned unkindly. Oh, girl, I'm trying to help you. In a motherly way, I'm warning you. And you're throwing a stone in my teeth. The woman waved her hand at her young partner. That's how young people are now. You want to them as best as possible, and they in return you and snap back. Let's finish checking the names, Mrs. Mary asked Bella. The girl wanted to change the unpleasant subject as soon as possible. She also wanted to finish her work quickly, so that she could go to another meeting with Michael. So 2 months passed, during which Bella felt absolutely happy. The girl lived in an old one-room flat, inherited from her mother. And here they often met with Michael, who sometimes even stayed with the girl for the night and on weekends. Michael himself explained to Bella that he rented a flat in the city center with one of his acquaintances. Because of this, he could not normally invite his beloved to him. He did not want unnecessary questioning on the part of his mate. Their relationships between young people were becoming more and more serious, and Bella waited for a long time that Michael was about to make her an offer. However, this dream of hers was not destined to come true. One evening, the guy came home to Bella in an extremely depressed mood. When asked what happened, he reluctantly replied, "Problems at work." He slowly stretched out, but immediately added, "Don't worry, it's nothing serious, just standard work stuff." Isabella looked at her lover with undisguised excitement. "Can I help you in any way?" asked the girl, who was just cooking in the kitchen and trying to put together a delicious dinner for her lover. The oven timer beeped loudly, informing her that her favorite dish, baked chicken, was ready. "Oh, here comes the chicken," she said, pulling out a hot baking tray and placing it on the table. "Michael, don't worry about work." "I'm sure it will all work out somehow," Isabella said. "Wash your hands and sit down at the table. Dinner is the best cure for the burdens of the day. That's what my mom used to say." Bella smiled, and Michael gave her a faint smile in return, then lazily wandered off to the bathroom. Bella felt that something serious had happened. It was just that her lover didn't want to talk about it. A little later, when they were already sitting at the table, she managed to find out the reason for such a bad mood of the young man. "I'm sick of all this," Michael threw his fork on the table. "If you only knew how tired I am of going to this damn office every day to work for my stupid boss." "Quiet, Michael. Don't shout like that," the girl asked him. "Can you explain what's wrong with you?" Michael looked at her with his beautiful light green eyes instead of answering. He looked pale and somehow haggard. God, what could have upset him so much, Bella wondered to herself. "I'm tired," Bella the boy answered her simply. "Tired of the fact that no matter what I do, I'll remain a mere analyst. A small fry in this world. Really big money that I may never have to see." Isabella looked wistfully at her lover. "Is it really that bad?" "Not at all," Michael exclaimed. "That bastard Black, my boss, only does that to pester me every day. He's not satisfied with my results." The guy shook his fist angrily in the air. "And what do you want with such low sales? Is it my fault your managers don't do anything? It's like this every day, Bella. Every single day this year, it's all about draining everyone else. And he only gave us a pay rise 2 years ago. And that was by a few pennies. God, how tired I am of it. I'm sick of it." Michael hunched over and wrapped his arms around his head. "God, Michael, calm down, sweetheart. Don't be like that." Isabella stroked his back. "Why didn't you tell me before about how bad it was for you?" "I didn't mean to upset you," Bella the young man said. "You're the best thing in my life. How can I put my problems on you?" Bella felt her heart beating harder at the words of her beloved. "You're an important part of my life too, Michael," she answered seriously and looked into his eyes. "That's why we must learn to share everything with each other, both good and bad. Only trust will help us to keep our relationship, trust and love." Michael froze for a second, then put his arms around Bella and kissed her tenderly. "You are the most incredible, sensitive, intelligent and understanding girl in the world, Isabella. I love you." Bella smiled and snuggled against Michael's chest, then asked him in a quiet voice, "If you can't bear to be in this job, maybe you should look for another place. I'm sure that such an excellent specialist like you can find a decent place with a good salary." Michael only sighed heavily and pulled away from the girl. "Well, if it could make a difference, honey. But in every place like this, the same story will repeat itself every time. I'll be working. The others, the ones that came in on the take, will at best do nothing and get the bonus I'm entitled to, and at worst they'll just ruin the whole business. But why do you care so much?" Bella couldn't understand him. If the company goes bankrupt because of the short-sighted actions of its top managers, won't it be their problem? What could be your problem? Michael began to pace her small kitchen. Bella, honey, you just don't understand. If I had a business like this, I would make sure that every employee within my staff was in his or her place. Then I could run things myself, manage the process. We could get married and think about buying our own big and spacious house, having kids again. Cause, what can I give you now? Nothing. I can't do that, Bella. I have to think about tomorrow. I'm a man, after all." Michael went to the window and stared thoughtfully at the silhouettes of the high rises on the horizon. Isabella didn't know how to help her lover in such a situation, so she only asked, "What do you need to start such a company yourself?" The answer pleased her at the same time, but also upset her. Everything is banal. My beloved money, everything, and always rests on them. Except I can't even get a loan. I don't have anything to pledge to the bank, and the interest rates are crazy. I don't know if I can pay it back. A thought slowly began to form on the periphery of Isabella's mind. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was, but she seemed to have an idea of how she could help her favorite guy. What if you had a co-signer with collateral who could put in a good word for you in case of emergency? Would you be approved for a loan? Michael turned round sharply, and in his eyes Bella saw a fierce glimmer of hope mixed with uncertainty. Yes, he said slowly. Yes, it would greatly increase the chances of success. Bella bit her lip, considering her actions and words. Of course, she was willing to do anything for Michael. A loan wasn't such a big deal after all. Michael would put the money to good use, and with his integrity, persistence, and intelligence, he'd be lucky. He will definitely make a brilliant businessman. She was sure of that. Michael, then consider that you have such a guarantor. Isabella said decisively, I'm willing to help you with a loan if it will help your dream come true. For a second, she thought her lover's eyes flashed with a strange fire. But Bella thought it was probably just a figment of her imagination. Still, the decision of the surety was extremely serious, and the girl could not help but worry, thinking it over. Isabella, my girl, my angel. Are you sure you want to do this? Michael asked her, taking the girl by the shoulders. You just don't have to do it if you don't want to. It's not like I'm insisting. I'm just sharing my thoughts with you. Oh, honey, don't, she reassured him. I'm doing this for both of us, for our future together. On Michael's lips played a beautiful, but a little sly smile, as if the guy had already decided everything for himself. Bella thought then that it was, of course, about their house together and the creation of a family. You won't regret it, I swear to you, he assured her. As soon as I open my own business and we get the first profit, we'll apply for a marriage license. You'll be my wife, won't you? Michael asked with a smile, just in case. Are you still asking? Of course, yes, exclaimed a happy Bella and hugged her lover tightly. The next day, Michael returned from work, unexpectedly earlier than usual, and immediately rushed Bella, who had that day off. Bella, honey, I've already arranged everything. My friend advised me a great bank, where the interest is low, and the guarantor can easily become a guarantor. All you have to do is bring your passport and the deeds to the flat. So soon? The girl was amazed. Michael, maybe you and I will choose a bank together a little later. Let's see what other options are available. On the face of her lover ran a subtle shadow of discontent and irritation, but he held back, saying aloud as affectionately as possible. What to expect, beloved? Suddenly they have such a unique offer with a limited period of time. Now we'll miss it, and that's it. We can consider the idea a failure. The sooner I get the money, the sooner we can start looking at our own place. Don't you want that? And the wedding? I don't know about you, but I'm going to celebrate it to the full. Only nobody has given us any money yet, the girl tried to reason with him. Honey, please, let's make this decision together. It's all happening too fast. Michael was increasingly difficult to contain his irritation, so he came to the girl and hugged her by the shoulders so hard that Bella involuntarily shrieked. It seemed to her that Michael's usually so gentle fingers suddenly turned into steel pincers. Ow, it hurts, Michael. What are you doing? The girl shrieked at him in surprise. I'm sorry, he immediately released her. It's just that I'm so nervous about this whole loan thing. I want to realize all our dreams as soon as possible. I understand, my love, Bella nodded. I just want everything to go right, to be sure that this bank is reliable. Michael made a resentful face and lifted his chin. Well, if you don't trust my lawyer friend, then. Remember, you were the first one to talk about trust. The girl finally sighed and agreed. All right, let's follow your intuition. Wait for me a minute, I'll just change. Half an hour later, they were on their way to the bank branch, where, having shown the specialist all the necessary documents and waiting for the decision of the commission, Michael received his loan, and Bella became his guarantor, offering as collateral his flat. As soon as Michael's account was the coveted amount, The young man immediately began to tell Isabella about his grandiose plans. According to his assumptions, they will have to close the loan in just 6 months, if the idea, which he has been hatching for years, will be a success among his fellow investors. I've made some connections while working in this stupid office Michael shared with his beloved, and a couple of investors have even agreed to listen to my proposals. Only for this I will have to leave the city for a while, purely for work issues related to production. Michael continued to share his plans. Wait, you mean you're leaving? Isabella looked at him in surprise. But why? You don't have a concrete plan for what you plan to do yet. The business you told me about, of course, looks very tempting. But Michael, the guy, rolled his eyes theatrically. No way, please. How many times do you have to pull me every time? Tell me, don't you believe me? Do you think I'm going to run away with this money and leave you all alone? Bella's insides tightened. She couldn't imagine such a thing. She trusted her fiancé too much. No, of course not, honey, she said, embarrassed. Well, Michael continued. The investors have privately agreed to take me in and show me possible areas where I can put my future equipment. Isn't that a decisive step in the direction of our dream? Isabella smiled weakly at her fiancé. She realized that he was trying, as they call it, to strike while the iron is hot. But only in her soul she always had an uneasy light, when she imagined that she and Michael would have to be separated, even if only for a week. Promise you'll call me every day? Isabella asked him. This is the first time you'll be away from me. It's not a test. I'm just worried. Michael ran his hand gently over her face. I'll not only call you, I'll text you every day, he smiled affectionately. You'll see you'll get tired of me. They spent that evening together. Michael was with Bella, very caring, tender, and the girl felt herself on the 7th heaven from love. There was no one in the world she could trust as much as her adoring fiancé. The young analyst explained to her that he would take a morning flight to another city, and from there to meet with one of the investors. The girl let her lover go without a second thought and started counting the minutes until his return. A couple of hours after Michael's departure, Bella's mobile phone rang, to her surprise. It was her immediate superior calling, and his tone was not at all friendly. Well, Swan, he said sharply. Excuse me? Bella stammered. She really didn't know why the boss would be so angry with her. She and Mrs. Mary had closed the last shift more than well. There had been no shortages. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Shouted the warden. It's a shame that Mrs. Mary was so worried about you, so protective of you, and you stole from us, you scum. Bella stood in the middle of her small living room and flapped her eyes in confusion. Bella felt as if everything that was happening was not happening to her, as if she were watching some low-brow show on TV. Mr. Sam, let me come over here now, and you can explain everything to me, she asked, because I don't know what happened in there, but I'm sure there's some ridiculous mistake. You'll come, the director grumbled on the other end of the line. Yes, of course you will, and you'll pay me back the whole debt, like a sweetheart, so that you'll be there in an hour. Do you understand? Bella said goodbye briefly and began to pack. In less than an hour, she was already in the office where Mr. Sam Smith, the branch manager of their press kiosk, was sitting. Entering the office, the girl, to her great surprise, found her partner there as well. Mrs. Mary looked tired and anxious, as if she had been up all night. But when she looked at Bella, her eyes were filled with hatred. Ah, here you are. The headmaster started from the doorway and locked the door behind her. But please explain, where did you put 40,000 of the proceeds? What? Bella almost choked with indignation. What 40,000? What are you talking about? I gave the cash to the collectors the day before yesterday. Yeah, Mrs. Mary's a witness. We counted it all together. She, however, threw up her full hands in resentment and shook her head. Bella, let's not do that. Don't involve me in your machinations, please. What machinations? Mrs. Mary, you saw me handing over the bag to the collectors with your own eyes. To her amazement, her partner began to sob, and then cried and put a handkerchief to her eyes. Why are you doing this to me, Bella? Have I ever treated you badly? I'm a grown-up woman. You might say I'm in my 5th decade. Am I going to lie to Mr. Sam? I didn't see that amount of money packed in that bag. That's a fact. What you put in that bag, I have no idea. Mrs. Mary continued to sob. Bella didn't know what to say for herself. There were no cameras in that kiosk. The boss himself had been greedy. He hadn't spent any money on installing them, relying on the honesty of his female employees. And now it turns out Bella was accused of stealing. "Don't you have anything to say to that, Bella?" Mr. Sam asked her, suppressing the anger in his voice. "I trusted you so much. I mean, you've been with us since you were 19. You're like family. And now this betrayal. You live and learn. You can't trust anyone in this world. No one." Bella could barely suppress the urge to cry right here in the office of her boss. She really truly loved this job. After graduating from school, when it turned out that her mother was ill, the girl did not waste time on education and immediately got a job at this kiosk. They paid here correctly every fortnight. And only this money allowed Bella's family to stay afloat at a time when her mother could not physically work as a cleaner in the local school. "Mr. Sam, I swear to you that I had nothing to do with stealing that money," Bella repeated stubbornly. And then out of the corner of her eye, she saw Mrs. Mary grinning into her handkerchief. Bella realized that she had been set up. "So you don't want to give me that money back, do you?" The boss reached for the receiver of the old telephone. "All right, Bella. Then let the police deal with you. After all, you're neither my daughter nor my niece to mess with." "Wait a minute, Mr. Sam," Bella exclaimed in despair. "But let me work the money off if you like. Take all my wages for the next 2 months, but don't call the police." However, the boss only shook his head negatively. "No, there's no way I can allow someone like you to work in my kiosk. Money, of course, from your salary deducted, but so be it. Take pity on you, foolish. But don't go on the next shift. You're fired." At that moment, the girl thought she'd gone deaf. Fired? How could she be fired? She'd worked at Rospechat for so many years. The whole kiosk and every newspaper in it was like her own. However, choosing between dismissal and forfeiture of 2 months' wages or prison, Bella chose the latter. When she and Mrs. Mary left the office, the girl turned to her former partner. "Why did you do this to me, Mrs. Mary? What have I done to offend you so?" The woman squinted angrily, but a victorious smile played on her lips. "You shouldn't have been always happy and cheerful, as if you didn't work in a kiosk, but every day as if you were going out on holiday. You should be more modest, child." And then the partner contemptuously looked at the girl from head to toe. "All those workplace affairs you're having, I've always disliked them. Look at that redhead showing off. No face, no skin. All those suitors chasing after her. No, just a little bit at a time. Maybe life will teach you that you should conduct your affairs modestly and not poison others with your happiness." Bella stood dumbfounded, looking at Mrs. Mary. She had expected anything but this. "So you were jealous of her, were you?" she asked, tears streaming from her own eyes. "Out of ordinary female jealousy?" Mrs. Mary just waved her hand, saying, "Don't be dramatic," and then she added, "You can't prove anything anyway. And I need that money more. I've wanted to go on holiday to the sea for a long time, but I couldn't get the money I needed." "Be glad you got off so lightly, you fool," said Mrs. Mary. "I've been working in shops for years. A mouse like you would be a piece of cake to deal with." With these words, Mrs. Mary looked round, and making sure that no one could hear them, walked quietly and leisurely away in the direction of the exit. She felt as if she had really just been dumped in the mud. Unable to contain the storm of warring emotions any longer, the girl stepped out into the fresh air and decided to call Michael. She realized that it must have been a short time since he had boarded the plane. By now, her fiancé must have just checked into the hotel. But she could not wait any longer, and, having dialed the cherished number, she was ready to hear her dear and beloved voice, when suddenly, instead of her fiancé, she was answered by the operator's dry mechanical answering machine. "The subscriber is switched off or is out of the network coverage area." Isabella Swan glanced at her wristwatch and frowned. By all plans, Michael should have landed by now. An uneasy feeling crept into her heart. Had something happened to the plane? Bella remembered what Michael had said about his flight and called the airport. And when a polite employee explained to her that the flight she was asking about did not exist, Isabella, having lost her balance abruptly, fell to the floor without feelings. When Bella regained consciousness, no one was around. Luckily, she hadn't been lying there long, so at least she hadn't been cleaned out. But who was she kidding? She'd been cheated, it seemed. In one of the most sneaky and lowly ways possible, they had invaded her trust to help her apply for a loan. The girl found it hard to believe that Michael could run away with the money, depriving her of essentially everything. There was nothing to pay the interest to the bank. She had no job. That meant her flat would be taken by the bank very soon. Isabella didn't want to accept what was happening. It seemed that her whole life, which had been going well, was shattering like a crystal vase that had fallen to the floor. The girl, for the next few days, without ceasing, called Michael, but each time she answered the operator, claiming that the number of her fiancé out of network. Most likely, Michael has just thrown out the SIM card and now happily hiding somewhere with a few $1,000,000, which so successfully divorced the poor girl. For Bella, however, remained a mystery, whether the cunning analyst really saved her then from the bandits or it was all a carefully thought-out plan. Well, I guess I'll never know, she thought sadly to herself and deleted Michael's number from her phone book. For the next week, Isabella Swan was in a terrible state. The last time she had felt this bad was after her mother's death. She wanted to call Anne first. Surely her friend wouldn't judge her. Perhaps she could help her think of something to do with the money. But Bella was too proud for that and didn't want to pressure her best friend with her problems. And then the girl saw on Anne's social networks that she and her fiancé flew on holiday to some distant warm islands. Isabella saw this as a kind of sign, saying that she is destined to pass this difficult test alone. Then Bella began to look for a new job. Here she received an unpleasant surprise. None of the little or even decent firm did not want to see in its staff a person without education, who's only experienced the sale of press. No matter how erudite Bella looked at interviews, the answer was always the same: "I'm sorry, but you are not suitable for us." In the end, despairing, the girl opened a newspaper of free adverts and there unexpectedly saw an unusual vacancy. The country house required a maid with the functions of a carer. The patient was an elderly businessman who, due to illness, could not serve himself. Bella thought that she could help this man because she took care of her mother when she was ill. And the fact that it will be necessary to clean the house, so it's nothing. The salary in the advert promised a very decent salary. So the girl decided to try her luck and called the number given. The next morning, a big black SUV with beautiful license plates picked her up. Bella immediately realized that it was for her, as the day before she had agreed with the manager of the businessman that she would be brought to their mansion. On the way to the mansion, she met the businessman's driver, John Carter. The kind, cheerful chap immediately put Bella at ease. He told his young passenger funny anecdotes and at the same time taught her how to behave when meeting with the businessman. "You, the main thing, Mr. Tom Brown, do not be afraid," John Carter admonished her. "He is generally a very good man. Only his fate is not an easy one. His wife died a couple of years ago in a car crash. He's been on the wane ever since. And lately there's a kind of sadness in his eyes. He needs moral support, someone to be there for him all the time." "Why don't you call a professional doctor for him?" Bella asked. "He doesn't want to," John said calmly. "Of course he has a doctor who visits him from time to time. But Mr. Brown himself doesn't like it very much. All those white coats, the smell of medicine, they make him nervous. But I warn you, I've got a bit of experience too. I've only looked after my mum, so I only know the basics of medicine." "Somehow I think that will be more than enough," the driver answered her and smiled. When the girl was brought to Brown's estate, that was the businessman's surname, Bella opened her mouth involuntarily, seeing the scale of the whole plot. There was a rose garden and figures of trees, and even something that she had seen before only on the pages of magazines, namely a small shaped labyrinth made entirely of greenery. And the businessman's mansion itself was truly astonishing to the imagination of the average person. It resembled a small medieval castle, only equipped with all the latest technology and cameras. Just amazing. Isabella exhaled, looking at all this splendor. "Yes, this house is very impressive when you're not used to it." John stood next to her. "When I first got a job here, I couldn't believe for a week that I could live in such luxury. But then I got used to it." A little later, the manager scrutinized Bella's personal file and, to her luck, decided that she was quite suitable for them. Another day was needed to move to the millionaire's mansion, all the things necessary for the girl, after which she was fully ready to start work. The girl was taken to the office for domestic staff, where they gave her a uniform and explained her duties. Bella listened very attentively. The last thing in the world she wanted was to accidentally forget something in her long list of daily chores. "Good morning, Mr. Tom Brown." She said a shy hello to her ward as she was led into his room and introduced to the businessman. "I'll be helping you now." Mr. Brown was a man paralyzed from the waist down who looked to be about 65 years old. His pleasant, noble appearance inspired Bella with some confidence, though her heart was shattered after the story with Michael. Isabella now saw a catch in everything and was afraid to trust men, even in small things. She realized that it was foolish to lump them all together. Mr. Brown looked at his new maid and smiled. "Your name is Isabella Swan," he said, looking curiously at her fiery red hair. "Yes, that's right," she answered, a little embarrassed. "I applied for a job with you. I was told by the manager that you needed an ordinary man for this position." The millionaire continued to look at her with obvious interest, so that the girl involuntarily became uncomfortable. Finally, he asked, wheeling up to her in his buggy. "Bella, may I ask you an indiscreet question?" Isabella felt herself blushing, but nodded in agreement. "Is your hair naturally this interesting color?" At that moment, Bella's mind began to think that this old rich man might like her not so much as a carer, but as a woman. Fortunately, it turned out not to be so. "Yes, it's my natural color. My mom had the same color." For a second, Bella thought that a slight shadow of alarm ran across Mr. Brown's face, but she wasn't sure. The businessman answered her nothing but offered. "Will you play checkers with me? Can you?" He asked with a slight slyness and winked at the girl. "Of course, I don't like to play chess, but checkers is always welcome." Bella smiled politely and began to arrange multicolored checkers on the board. The maid and the businessman played 3 games at once, after which it was time for a massage and helping the man in a number of other procedures. Fortunately, the girl did not have to do Mr. Brown's bathing. The businessman had a special person from among the domestic servants for this purpose. When all the procedures were finished and Mr. Brown lay down to rest, Isabella decided to tidy up the room. She gathered some things and was about to wipe down the bookcase, when suddenly a loud female voice came from downstairs. "Where's Daddy?" "What do you mean he's sleeping? This is actually my parents' house. I can come when I want. You shouldn't have come," Isabella heard a few minutes later. A strikingly beautiful young woman burst into the room like a whirlwind. It seemed to Bella that before her stood a real supermodel, which she as a child so fond of looking at for hours on the pages of old library magazines. "Daddy, I'm home." "Oh, who the hell are you?" she asked Isabella rudely, and looked her over from head to toe with a frankly snobbish, contemptuous look. "Caroline, calm down. This is my new maid," said Mr. Brown in a hoarse voice. "Isabella, please meet my daughter Caroline." "How do you do?" said the girl, her voice trembling with excitement. But Caroline only turned away, throwing her through her teeth, dismissed. Isabella did not immediately realize that the rich woman was addressing her, but when she looked at her over her shoulder, she quickly left the room. She could still hear Caroline snorting unpleasantly at the door when she was distracted by Mrs. Emma telling her that dinner for the domestic staff was ready, and everyone was already gathering in the staff kitchen. A couple of hours later, when Isabella re-entered Mr. Brown's room, she thought the man looked somehow too pale. "Mr. Brown, what's the matter?" "Are you ill?" Bella asked excitedly and cautiously approached his bed. The man was silent in reply. Something incomprehensible flashed in his gaze. Bella thought that there was something wrong with his heart. She took his blood pressure just in case, and when she saw that the numbers on the display were very high, she rushed out of the room and downstairs. "John. Mrs. Emma. Somebody. Help," she called out. "What's the matter?" asked the butler, followed by the housekeeper. "Mr. Brown's not well. His blood pressure's off the scale. His heartbeat too," said Bella. "Oh God, not that," Mrs. Emma spluttered. "He's having another attack. John, I'll call a doctor. You drive up to the gates of the village. Show the paramedics the way so they can get here quicker. Don't leave your master until the paramedics arrive." Do everything you can to keep him unconscious." Bella nodded and ran back out. When she ran out into the room, she saw that the businessman's skin was already beginning to take on an unhealthy color. In addition, he was shaking as if he'd been electrocuted. Isabella took some ammonia to his nose and put a soft, double-folded handkerchief in his mouth so that the man would not bite his tongue in a fit. God forbid. The girl pinned him to the bed with her hands as hard as she could. 10 minutes later, an ambulance arrived at the millionaire's mansion. The man was promptly relieved of the seizure, and the doctor, looking at Bella, only sadly shook his head. "The attacks have been getting more frequent lately," he said. "We'd like to take Mr. Tom Brown to the hospital, but he's absolutely against it. Stubborn. We've controlled the seizure and given him sleeping pills. So he'll sleep for a few hours. After that, hopefully he'll feel better. It's good that you were there for him. At times like this, it's important to have someone who cares and knows a little first aid." "What is his illness?" the girl ventured to ask. "We're not sure ourselves," said the doctor uncertainly. "At first we thought it was epilepsy. Seizures damage the cerebral cortex, hence the paralysis of the limbs. But now it's too ambiguous to be certain. It could very well be a tumor that we have no way of locating." "So the prognosis is not good at all?" Isabella asked sadly. "I'm afraid that's something I can only discuss with family members." "You are just his carer," replied the doctor, looking sadly at the millionaire. "I think we should all prepare for the worst soon." After the doctors left, Mr. Tom Brown's face regained its natural blush and color. Isabella decided to see which of his prescribed medicines the man had taken last. It might well be that Mr. Brown had an intolerance to one or more of the components of a particular drug, and then much would be clearer. In the process of checking the prescription, she found a strange blue jar at the bottom of the chest of drawers without any identifying marks. There was nothing like it on the list, and it seemed a little suspicious to Bella. She opened the lid and looked inside. At the bottom were several bright red pills, the purpose of which remained a mystery to the girl. Bella asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Emma, about the drugs, but she couldn't give her a clear answer, saying that all lists are strictly controlled by Brown's doctor and his daughter. The medicines are very expensive, so Caroline regularly brings her father everything he needs from the list herself. Isabella, being a kind but fair-minded person by nature, was determined to find out what this medicine was all about. While Mr. Tom Brown was unconscious, the girl read to him classical works of Russian literature, Pushkin's poems, and something from Spanish drama. The man had been asleep for over 10 hours. While putting another volume on the shelf, Bella accidentally elbowed some green book, and it fell to the floor and opened in the middle. Clumsy, she scolded herself, picking up the book. But then she noticed something that made her squat down and fall forward on her knees. An old photograph the size of a small postcard had fallen out of the book. Isabella picked it up and turned it over. At the same moment, the world around her shook, and her eyes darkened sharply. "Mum," Isabella whispered, looking at the photo. The picture was indeed Bella's mother, only very young and beautiful. Isabella recognized the photo immediately, for she had a small silver pendant in the shape of a heart hanging from her chest. One half of it opened if the pendant was pressed lightly. Inside was the exact same photo, only scaled down by a factor of 3. But how could this be possible? Bella asked herself, shifting her gaze from her own photograph to the one she had found in the book. The maid decided not to ask the businessman anything for the time being, as he was already having a hard time. When Caroline arrived the next day, she was in tears as she clung to her sick father's chest. "Daddy, how did you frighten us all?" She spoke in what seemed to be a deliberately loud and false voice. It seemed to be done so that everyone in the house could hear her lamentations. "Come on," Mr. Tom Brown patted her on the back. He had regained consciousness and was beginning to talk and move around in his wheelchair again. "Tell me how your new fiancé is doing. When are you going to introduce him to me?" Caroline smiled so broadly that it looked as if her cheekbones were about to collapse. A little later she answered, "It's so sweet that you're interested in everything that's going on in my life. Soon my beloved and I will surely come here together to ask for your blessing. But you get well first, because I pay such a lot of money to these idlers, and they bring you to a new attack." At the last words, Caroline looked at Bella and John Carter, who were standing there, with such an angry look that it seemed that the beauty had one wish in her heart, that Bella and the businessman's driver would turn to dust right here, right in front of her eyes. "So these fellows, on the contrary, did their best to save my life," said Mr. Tom Brown. "Especially Isabella, a very good girl. Don't scold her." Caroline gave Bella a look of pure fury. Then she kissed her father on the forehead and said, as if nothing had happened, "All right, let them live for now. Dad, I'll go then, because I have to go to our office, some things with your partners to solve. You don't mind, do you?" On the face of the millionaire blossomed a benign smile. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'm just happy that my business has such a worthy successor. Tell Mr. Harper not to rush into another deal. We'll have to see how those Chinese behave." Mr. Tom Brown and his daughter Caroline discussed some business matters, after which Caroline sailed past Bella like a swan across the surface of a night lake, leaving the room. The maid, however, was determined and slipped after the beauty into the corridor. "Wait, please, Caroline," she asked the girl. She stopped half-stepping and turned slowly to Isabella Swan. "Are you talking to me?" she asked, stretching her vowels. "I think you're the only one here. I was checking your father's medication the other day, and I found a strange vial, blue in color, with no labels or inscriptions. It had red pills inside." "So?" The heiress raised her head. "Do you know what kind of medicine it is? It just wasn't on the list. And I think Mr. Tom Brown is allergic, maybe to some drug." "No, that's out of the question," Caroline exclaimed and flung her finest silk scarf over her shoulder defiantly. "I personally buy all my dad's medication. And what you're describing are, just so you know, very expensive vitamins from Germany. They are sold by the piece. That's why I put them in a separate vial, so as not to mix them up." "Ha," said Bella. "Vitamins, then? Then all the more reason to have them analyzed. Maybe there's some exotic ingredient in their composition that could provoke such a reaction? I've heard that expensive vitamins can have some pretty—" Caroline interrupted her with a regal wave of her hand. "I don't have time to listen to any more of this nonsense. Everything I bring my father is the best, and there can't be any reactions there. After all, what am I reporting to some maid? Go scrub the floors. Or don't you have anything else to do?" Bella decided not to poison her soul, and with a short nod went to the kitchen. However, as soon as she left the estate, Isabella Swan crept cautiously into the garage to John Carter. "John, can I talk to you for a moment?" the girl asked him. As the guy approached her, Bella whispered, afraid that someone might hear her. "I have a huge favor to ask of you. Would you mind driving me into town tomorrow? I want to take something to a private clinic for analysis, and I wanted to borrow some money from you to pay for the examination." John smiled and winked playfully at the girl. "What's that? Then, what's the drive?" Bella shifted from foot to foot, but finally decided to share her suspicions with the driver. "This may be completely crazy, of course, but I want to check out Mr. Tom Brown's vitamins, the ones in the blue vial. Something tells me they're not that helpful." John immediately became serious. "I've worked for Mr. Tom Brown for a long time. I can safely say he's like family to all of us here, and I'll do everything I can to make sure he gets better." The next morning, Bella and John went to the clinic, covering themselves with the excuse that they were going to the supermarket for some of the products that the owner of the mansion asked Bella personally. The girl really hoped that during these few hours of absence nothing fatal would happen to him. Isabella Swan had been looking after Mr. Tom Brown on her day off anyway, and had spent some time with him before leaving, following all the instructions of his attending physician. When they arrived at the laboratory, Bella gave the specialists 3 red pills, after which John Carter still paid them extra for the speed of the examination. Eventually, after several hours, during which the driver and the maid had indeed visited the shop and bought groceries, the lab technician who conducted the tests came out to them with the conclusion in his hands. His face was extremely puzzled. "Where did you say you bought these vitamins?" he asked, looking at the papers. "In Germany," replied Bella calmly. "Why, is there something wrong with them?" The medic's face darkened in an instant. "If in Germany patients are prescribed heavy psychotropic drugs as vitamins without a prescription, then I think it's time for me to leave medicine. It is absolutely forbidden for a normal, healthy person to take such a cocktail. Are you serious? John couldn't help himself. So you mean that it's not even additives? Bella was astonished to the core. She leaned lightly on John's shoulder to keep from falling. Never before in my life have I encountered a situation like this. Tell me, what exactly can happen to a person if they take this for a long period of time? The maid asked. There can be many variations, said the doctor. But in the vast majority of cases, it is paralysis of consciousness. Some of the signs of epilepsy are possible, but in the end, it always ends with the death of the patient. God, thank you, doctor. She thanked the laboratory assistant and, taking from him the document with the conclusion and expertise, hurried back to the millionaire's house. Do you realize what this means? She said to John on the way home. Mr. Tom Brown has been deliberately poisoned with these pills. All the symptoms of Brown's illness are exactly the same. The driver looked worried, as did the maid. But there was a look of doubt on his face. It is, of course, astonishing, but just. Who would want to do such a thing? I tell you, everyone in the house is very fond of the master. I think the answer is obvious. Caroline buys all the drugs. Besides, she's admitted to me herself that she thinks those awful things are vitamins. She also lied to me about Germany. I don't quite understand why a daughter would poison her own father. Then John couldn't take it any longer and pulled over. Parked on the curb. Bella. There really is something to this. Caroline, she's not related to Mr. Tom Brown. Brown married her mother when she had a child. That was Caroline, only 5 years old at the time. So Mr. Tom Brown adopted her. Oh God. Isabella understood. Now that her mother was dead. And there's no telling what kind of accident it was, maybe not without her involvement. And she's decided to eliminate her stepfather too, so she can take over his company. Why? I mean, she's already running the place pretty well. We must inform the owner as soon as possible. The young driver nodded and started the engine. God forbid she should realize that you suspect something. She's a very cunning woman. When they reached the mansion, it was discovered that Mr. Tom Brown had had another attack. And a couple of hours before, his favorite stepdaughter had been in the house again. The doctor who examined the businessman came to a disappointing conclusion. I'm afraid our Mr. Tom Brown won't survive another one of these attacks. And there won't be any more, said Isabella resolutely, taking out the vial and showing it and the report to the doctor. This was the cause of Mr. Brown's illness. Mr. Tom Brown will recover if he is not given these substances. The doctor looked at the pills in amazement and then read the report. But that's a drastic change. We need to call the police. We don't have enough evidence, said Bella. And we can't disturb Mr. Tom Brown now. But there are other ways of approaching it. A few hours later, Mrs. Emma, the housekeeper, rang and, unable to hold back her tears, asked Caroline to come. Caroline, please come right away at once. Not a minute. Your father is dying. Yes, he is. He's been sick again. The doctor said it's over. Caroline rushed in almost lightning fast and entered the house with a stride as sure and firm as a true mistress might enter a mansion. Where is father? What is the matter with him? Said the beautiful heiress menacingly. John then very politely escorted her to Mr. Tom Brown's room. He was lying unconscious under a drip, but he looked quite weak. The very life seemed to be draining out of him. Leave us alone. Caroline angrily ordered John, then slammed the door of the room right in front of the driver's nose. Father? Caroline spoke softly as she approached the dying businessman's bedside. Really? Have you finally deigned to leave this world and spare me and your business from your perpetual grousing? The pretty girl took a chair and sat down next to her stepfather. A gloating smile blossomed on her face. God, who knew how long I've waited for this. I can't believe how happy I am. You know, I was starting to worry. Why aren't my pills helping you finally get off your feet? Turns out all you had to do was wait a little longer. Well, you'll go feed the worms, just like my mom, who never had enough money. And me. I'll finally get down to the real business and make our company, no, sorry, father, my company proud of the whole country. No exaggeration. At this heartbreaking moment, The door of the room opened and a police investigator appeared on the doorstep with an open crust. "Who are you?" Caroline exclaimed. "What do you think you're doing?" The investigator walked unceremoniously up to the young woman and with a loud snap, handcuffed her wrists. "Now, if anyone will recognize you, it will be your cellmates," the policeman said with a smile. "Major Wilson, Detective Squad." "How dare you?" She was indignant. "I was saying goodbye to my terminally ill father. You disrupted our last meeting. How despicable. That you tried to poison the man who gave you absolutely everything in this life," Bella said sternly, following John and the housekeeper into the businessman's bedroom. "Fortunately, we were able to save Mr. Tom Brown from your monstrous pills. He's asleep now. But as soon as you are where you belong, namely in prison, your foster father will be immediately transferred to the best clinic where he will be properly cared for, and where you won't get to him," John threatened her with his fist. "God, I'm glad Mr. Tom Brown didn't hear any of that," Mrs. Emma said quietly, and put her handkerchief to her eyes, which were already full of tears. "It was so good that it was all over at last. Yes, the most important thing is that he is safe now." Bella nodded, smiling at her. Mr. Brown was transferred to a private clinic, where he was immediately given all the necessary treatment to remove, or at least eliminate as much as possible, the effects of the pills that had been poisoning him, as the test showed for almost 2 years. It took a long time for the man to recover, but he was still able to return to his usual life. Although the businessman could no longer walk fully and now moved with the help of a graceful cane, he was still glad that he could move on his own. When he was told of Caroline's betrayal, the businessman remained silent for a long time, unable to utter a word. It had wounded him to the very heart. However, he was still immensely grateful to Bella and everyone else that they did not leave him to his fate, helped the elderly businessman to save the most important thing he still had, his life. In gratitude for his rescue, he helped Bella close all her debts to the bank. Bella had to tell everything, as she could have lost her flat at that point. Wealthy businessman Mr. Tom Brown connected all his connections. The millionaire calculated that Michael at that moment was abroad in Greece, and he managed to arrest him. He cheated another, this time very wealthy lady. Later it turned out that the young man for many years has been engaged in a similar dark trade. So Bella wasn't his only victim. And what was Isabella Swan's biggest offense? The guy really did plan their encounter in advance, only he thought it was Anne, the girl's rich friend. He must have got it mixed up. And then he thought the wool from the lousy sheep. Now he was waiting for a long prison term. And he will have a chance to think about how many unhappy women he deceived, and how many fates he broke. Bella continued to work at the businessman's house. She became friends with John Carter, and later their sympathy grew into something more. John was completely different from Michael. He was honest, genuine, and most importantly, he loved Isabella for who she was and didn't try to use her for any dirty purposes. As for the photographs, Isabella once plucked up the courage to ask Mr. Tom Brown, "How can it be that my picture and the picture you have in one of your books are of the same woman? Is that your mum?" The millionaire asked her in amazement, studying the photograph in his own photo. "Wasn't her name Patricia by any chance?" "That's right," she nodded. "Did you know her?" Mr. Tom Brown shuddered and sank slowly into his chair. "Is that what it was that caught my eye about you the first time we met?" he said slowly. "You look just like your mother. Especially the hair. You see, Bella, I was very fond of your mother once. No, not really. Patricia was my first and only love, the woman I wanted to spend my life with." "What happened? Why didn't you do it?" the girl asked him cautiously. "Everything is simple to the point of banality," sighed the businessman. "My parents were so against our marriage that they forced me to leave Patricia and go to England to study. They wanted me to marry a girl from a powerful family and set a condition, either a life with Patricia, but in poverty because I'm disinherited, or the opportunity to continue the family business." "And you chose the second," Bella clarified. "Yes, I chose family and money," said Mr. Brown sadly. "If you only knew how many times I regretted that decision. But it was too late. Your mum must have taken offense and left town for good. We lived in another state when we were kids." "That's true," Bella confirmed. But then we came back. Mom had always lived very poor, and it was always hard on her. She died of cancer. She was in a lot of pain. When the millionaire looked at the girl, there was an inexpressible pain in his eyes. A few moments later, however, he suddenly asked, "Bella, do you know who your father is?" "No," the girl answered simply. Mom never liked to talk about it. Once, however, she said that he was an unworthy man, but that's all. At that second, Bella began to understand what Mr. Brown was getting at. "No," she said slowly. "You don't think that?" The elderly businessman fell to his knees in front of her. "Bella, please let me do a paternity test. What if you're my daughter? What if my Patricia left me a blood heir?" Isabella Swan, though completely confused by her feelings, still agreed. The next day they went to the clinic, where they did all the necessary tests, and a few days later the paternity of Mr. Tom Brown was confirmed. He was indeed Isabella's biological father. Apparently, when he left for England, his beloved was already pregnant, and not having time to tell the happy news to her fiancé who left her, ran away to another city. My darling daughter, the elderly businessman, hugged the girl and at the same time covered her face with kisses. How happy I am that fate has brought you to me in my old age." Daddy, Bella whispered back, unable to believe the miracle. Of course, Isabella forgave her father for the offense he had committed in his youth. Times were different then. And Mr. Tom, to some extent, was also understandable. The girl was sincerely glad that now they had found each other again, and that she had such a wonderful family after all the hardships that she had to endure because of Michael. 6 months later, Bella married John Carter. Father approved the candidacy of a young and faithful driver, in gratitude making him head of security in one of his banks. John was very happy about this. He loved Bella, and he loved Mr. Tom like his own father. And now it turned out he was his father-in-law. But isn't it a miracle, the lad thought sometimes. John honestly performs his duties and is considered one of the best employees of Mr. Brown's company. The wedding was lavish and beautiful. John and Bella spent it outdoors, surrounded by loyal friends and huge floral arches, hung with bright garlands. It was a magical wedding, which the girl remembered for the rest of her life. And 3 months later, Bella gave her husband the most desirable gift in the world, the news that she is expecting her firstborn. John all the pregnancy looked after his wife, as no man in the world would not do it. In any case, so thought Bella herself, taking from her loving husband another bunch of favorite grapes. After the due date, they had a wonderful baby girl, which the couple decided to call Mia. Parents are very hopeful that the grandfather will have time to see her wedding, while Mr. Tom is constantly fiddling with his granddaughter and considers her the most beautiful woman in the world, after his daughter. There is still a lot of time ahead for this family, and they will enjoy every day they have on this earth. Elena begged the doctor to put her daughter under a different name, and when she learnt the reason, MP4. Helen once again admired the sunset, sitting on the shore of the lake. The girl invariably had a paintbrush in her hands and an easel standing nearby. Spending time painting, she lost track of time, completely immersed in her pastime of drawing a love from her early childhood. She always tried to put on paper everything she liked, or, on the contrary, all her thoughts and experiences. She was also very fond of nature. Not a single detail escaped her attentive eye. She depicted the smallest strokes with remarkable accuracy. Helen's mom could always tell what mood her daughter was in. After all, her paintings and drawings spoke more eloquently than words. One glance was enough to tell. Memories of her mother, who had left this world so early, hurt her heart. Helen had been very close to her mother. She seemed to her the embodiment of femininity and beauty, because it was impossible to consider her otherwise. She seemed to warm everyone around her with her radiant smile, and it was impossible not to fall in love with her kind eyes. Helen idolized her mother, and so did her father, although he had a completely different personality. Father loved Helen's mum madly. They had traveled a very difficult path together, which led them to wealth. But unfortunately, to continue to go through life, he now had to go it alone. Mum died suddenly and quickly, just one day did not wake up. It turned out that she had suffered from a heart defect since childhood, but stubbornly hid it from everyone in her style not to bother or worry her loved ones. Therefore, no one even suspected of the disease. Helen still remembered that terrible day when her mother was gone, how her father screamed when he found his wife dead. The girl from fear crammed into the wardrobe and did not come out of there until the evening. The realization that she would never have her mother in her life came much later, when she and her father had to set up their lives together. Her relationship with her father was much more complicated, although Helen respected and obeyed him immensely. Hello, Helen. Missy Kate was a kind woman. As she was quite lonely, she was happy to stay with this family. All the more so because she adored the girl. Helen was also very fond of Mrs. Kate, and after her mother's death she grew especially fond of her. And today Mrs. Kate was the first to meet the girl after her walk. "Where have you been?" "Father will be back soon," she said. I was so enchanted by the sunset that I could hardly tear myself away. Helen smiled dreamily. Dreamer. The woman hugged her affectionately. "Go get changed and come down for dinner." After showering and tidying up, Helen went down to the living room where her father was already waiting for her. "Hello, daughter. Will you join me for dinner?" he asked, as if Helen had never done so before. "Of course, Papa," she replied affectionately, and followed her father. Mrs. Kate, too, was present at dinner as a very real member of the family. In spite of her strictness, Mr. Sam Smith respected her immensely. "Your birthday is coming up," said the father. "I have a surprise for you." What kind of surprise? Helen tensed. It always alarmed her when her father started talking in riddles, hurrying things along. "There are still 2 months until your birthday. You'll find out a little later. Right now, you have to pass the session." Father continued the meal in silence. That meant the conversation was over. No one present dared to break the silence, for he was very annoyed by the noise at the table. Helen looked sadly at the portrait of her mother that stood nearby on the shelf. The woman was smiling a radiant smile. Mum was the complete opposite of her father. She was always fun and easy to be with. And father was much softer under the influence of the charms of his charming wife. Lately he had become simply unbearable. Deep down, Helen was even afraid of him. She had learned from Mrs. Kate that her father had serious business problems. That explained his irritability. Finished with dinner, the girl went to her room. Soon to be 19, and she had never had a relationship with a guy. Though where would they come from if her father controlled her every move? Immersed in her unhappy thoughts, she flinched when she heard the phone ring. "My girl, hello, how are you?" It was her favorite aunt, her mother's sister. "I'm fine," Helen replied sadly, but then, when she realized it, she asked cheerfully, "And how are you? 1,000 years have not seen you. I missed you very much." Helen tried to hide the excitement of the call. Memories of her mum broke her soul again. She remembered how they had visited Aunt Emma in the village, and the time spent there had been one of her happiest childhood memories. That's why I'm calling. Aunt Emma's voice was still happy and cheerful. "Anyway, I'm inviting you to come and visit me for the summer. They say the summer will be hot. We'll go swimming together at the river." But as the question hung in the air, and Helen already saw herself in the village, to give an answer without consulting her father, it would be rash. "Shit, I've got a session to get through. Only then I might be able to come. And I have to agree with my dad." She heard a sigh of disappointment on the other end of the line. "But don't worry, I'll do my best." Helen tried to cheer up Aunt Emma. They agreed that Helen would call next week and said goodbye. On the village, Helen had always envied the people who lived there. Of course, they had to work much harder than city people, and the labor was mostly physical. But how much beauty they saw every day. A wide river full of fish, vast forests with their gifts, fields surrounding the village on almost all sides, a holy spring gushing from the ground. Helen had come to the little town for the summer to visit her aunt and Mrs. Kate. It had been a long time since she had been in these parts, where she had spent a happy childhood. Nature, springs with crystal clear water, memories came over the girl. For the last few years, Helen had felt lonely. Her father, Mr. Sam Smith, was absorbed in his work, trying to forget himself in it after the death of his wife. Aunt Emma often phoned her niece, especially after the loss of her sister, trying to support her morally, although she was going through grief herself. But Helen needed someone close to her, whose warmth she could feel, who needed her. The school term was coming to an end, bringing closer the inevitable conversation with her father. Helen rehearsed the upcoming dialogue, berating herself for her fear of her own parent. She hadn't seen much of him lately. He was literally sleeping at work. One day the girl managed to catch her father at home. He was sitting in his study, immersed in his laptop, with disheveled hair and 3-day stubble. "Dad, can I talk to you?" Helen asked timidly, opening the door. Yes, come in," Mr. Smith replied absent-mindedly, keeping his eyes on the screen. Helen sat down in the chair opposite. "Aunt Emma called yesterday," she began quietly. "It's good that she doesn't forget you. How's she doing?" Dad replied, not taking his eyes off the monitor. "She's fine. But she suggested something to me, and I wanted to discuss it with you," Helen exhaled. "Discuss it." Mr. Smith finally pulled himself away from his work and raised his eyebrows questioningly. "All right, I'm listening." "Aunt Emma has offered to stay with her this summer, and I'd like that very much. If you don't mind." Father thought for a moment. "All right, go have fun. But on one condition, you have to be home by your birthday. I hope you haven't forgotten that we're going to have a big party." Helen couldn't believe her happiness. She hadn't even expected her father to agree. She jumped up, hugged her parent, and kissed him on the top of his head. Tears glistened in his eyes. "That's it. Go on, daughter. I have to work." Mr. Smith abruptly dismissed her, returning to the computer. Helen left the office feeling inexplicably sad. That evening she phoned her aunt, telling her that she would be arriving soon. A few days later, Helen was already packing her bags, looking forward to her holiday. Despite her advanced age, she had never traveled anywhere on her own. So Helen smiled as she fell asleep on the train to the sound of the wheels. Her aunt met her on the deserted platform. "Helen, how long it's been since we've seen each other." Aunt Emma hugged her niece. "God, you're so beautiful. I can't believe it." After picking up their things, they set off on the motorbike with the sidecar. Driving past a large empty field, Helen admired the vastness and wildflowers. It had been a long time since she had seen such picturesque scenery. The warm rays of sunshine were folding into quaint islands, making her imagination plan their arrangement on the canvas. A gentle breeze blew her hair out of her braids, and despite the intense heat, Helen was incredibly happy. "Go into the hay, darling," said her aunt. "It's much cooler in here. It's very stuffy in the hut." After unpacking, Helen stepped out onto the porch and looked at the familiar but almost forgotten shapes of the neighbors' houses. Nothing seemed to have changed since the days when she had visited with her mother. "Let's go to dinner, dear." Emma put a hand on her shoulder. Helen brushed away a tear and followed her aunt. Lunch was to be in the garden, in a gazebo surrounded by a thicket of grapes. It was strange, but she and her father had never eaten outdoors, even though their garden was beautiful, preferring to eat at home. And here, dining outdoors seemed so natural that Helen ate even more than usual. "If this keeps up, I'm afraid I'll have to change my wardrobe," she laughed. "You can't spoil your slim figure," Aunt Emma flattered her. After a little silence, she added, "I'm sorry." "What are you sorry for?" Her niece hastened to reassure her. "I knew how badly you felt about your mother's death, but I never called you to me. You see, I was afraid. I was afraid that seeing you would make me feel worse. You know how close we were to her. I'm sorry for my cowardice. I only now realize how wrong I was." Emma was silent, and large tears rolled down her apron. Helen rushed to comfort her. Together they shed many tears until almost evening, and when they had calmed down, they began to stoke the village bath. The whole atmosphere of the place had a calming effect. For a moment, Helen even felt her mother's presence. "Tomorrow they promise a terrible heat wave. Shall we go swimming with you at the lake?" Auntie suggested it. Helen agreed without a second thought. They talked a little longer, and then went to their rooms. But sleep did not come, so the girl decided to go out on the porch, taking a plaid. Despite the hot days, it was a little chilly at night. The fence at her aunt's house was rather nominal, very low, so passers-by could easily see what was going on in their yard. Sitting down on the porch, Helen looked up at the sky studded with thousands of stars, and it seemed that even the sky here was quite different, not like in the city. Suddenly she heard a noise. At that time, a group of young men and girls appeared from around the corner. The guys were with a guitar, occasionally strumming the strings. Helen smiled at them. And suddenly she also wanted to give herself up to the impulse of youth, to have fun and party until morning, like most of her peers. But her father suppressed all her dreams and desires at the root. He even got angry when he saw her with a canvas and brushes. To say nothing of moonlight walks with the boys. Suddenly the company stopped in front of their house, and one of the guys stared at the girl sitting on the porch. Her long, dark hair fell down over her shoulders, and her fair porcelain skin inevitably drew the eye. Helen, embarrassed, looked away. "John, come on," shouted one of the girls, and the company moved on. The young man glanced round once more, but his friends quickly pushed him forward. Helen smiled to herself. So many new impressions she had never experienced before, and here in just one day. Waking up at dawn, the girl took her easel and went out into the courtyard, where there was a beautiful view. After making a few sketches, she hurried to help her aunt with breakfast, anticipating the trip to the lake. Freedom of movement thrilled her wildly, and passing through familiar and dear to her heart, she was plunged into a carefree and happy childhood. "Settled in?" Aunt Emma asked. "Yes, a bit of nature here, of course, is marvelous," shared Helen's impressions. Though Auntie saw everything perfectly well herself. Those burning merry eyes reminded her so much of her sister. Only it was noticeable that Helen was a bit stiff, as if she was afraid of being judged for any of her actions. "This isn't the city. There's real space here," the woman replied thoughtfully. After a quick snack, they grabbed a few things from home and put them in a basket, grabbed their beach gear, and headed to the beach by the lake. The splendor that presented itself to the girl's eyes was astonishing in its immensity. The lake with the clearest water was surrounded by pine trees on 3 sides. "Perhaps the scenery here is as good as any overseas resort," smiled Helen. "I wish I'd brought my easel. You'll have time, believe me. But today, let's sunbathe and swim," said Aunt Emma, nodding towards the blanket she had spread out. Helen took off her sundress, leaving her in a fashionable bronze-colored swimming costume. She had bought this item of clothing in advance, knowing that she would be swimming in the local pond. Suddenly the girl felt someone's gaze on her. Turning round, she noticed a familiar group of young people who had passed by their house last night. Looking at her was still the same guy as yesterday. Only today his gaze was a little different. Today it was as if he was studying her, unashamedly, examining her from head to toe. That piercing gaze made Helen uncomfortable. She sat down next to Aunt Emma and pulled out a book, trying to concentrate, but it wasn't working. So she glanced round at the group. Suddenly one of the girls walked up to the guy and literally hung around his neck. Helen looked at him disappointedly and turned away, feeling a strange feeling. After lying a little under the rays of the hot sun, Helen and her aunt took a dip in the water. Her eyes involuntarily cast a glance at the place where the same company was resting. But that fellow Helen did not notice. Instead, she saw the girl, who now sat alone and was obviously upset about something. The water in the lake was really beautiful, despite the fact that it was quite cool. According to the auntie's story, the reason for this was due to underground springs running directly into the lake. Having thoroughly enjoyed their swim, Helen and Aunt Emma did not return home until near evening and immediately began to prepare dinner. "You won't believe it, but I haven't had such a great time in a long time," Auntie confessed. "I haven't had proper company. You know, when my husband died, I thought my heart would burst with longing. But time heals. I realized that my business on this earth was not yet finished. And although fate didn't reward me with children, I have you, and it's been a long time since I've felt as wonderful as I do today." Aunt Emma brushed away her tears. Helen rushed to comfort her. "Maybe you'd better move in with us. We have a big house and Daddy I don't think would mind," the girl suggested. "No, honey, my place is here. I've got my soul attached to it. This is where I'll end my journey. But I want you not to forget this place either. After all, this house will be yours when I die." Helen answered nothing, pressing Aunt Emma to her bosom. She stroked her wavy hair, from which gray strands were poking out. After enjoying the cool of the evening, they returned to the house. It was getting dark, but Helen didn't want to go to bed. She went out on the veranda and took a warm blanket and a cup of herbal tea. Leaning back in the old armchair, she gazed at the stars and dreamed. When she heard the creak of the wicket door opening, she shuddered. On the path directly to her walked the same young man, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. The girl froze from fear and excitement at the same time, but did not move. "Hello, stranger. Sorry to intrude, but I had no other choice," he pronounced. "Didn't know when I'd be able to see you again." John looked Helen straight in the eye and smiled. "These are for you," he said, holding out the flowers to her. Helen accepted them, giving the young man a radiant smile. "May I sit down?" he asked. "I suppose you may, but you'll have to introduce yourself," she said, trying to hide her excitement. John, the young man, answered immediately. "And you are Helen, aren't you?" "How do you know?" she wondered. "I had to find out." The boy smiled. Helen noticed the shadows in the window of the dark room and knew that Mrs. Kate was watching them, but she did not interfere with their acquaintance. "Wouldn't your girlfriend be unhappy that you'd come here?" Helen decided to ask, for the question had been on her mind ever since she had seen them. "I've been cuddling with Anne for a month on the beach. I don't have a girlfriend. Anne's just a friend. We rent a house near you. For the second summer in a row, there are 5 of us, 3 guys and 2 girls. We're all studying together at one of the universities in town. And this place was an accident, but we fell in love with it unconditionally." John's voice was so pleasant that Helen was ready to listen to it all night. At last the tension between them disappeared, and Helen even dared to tell him briefly about her life. The time passed quickly, and they said goodbye when dawn was about to break. Helen immediately fell asleep in her cozy bed with thoughts of her new acquaintance. Meanwhile, John returned to the house where his friends were waiting for him. "How did it go?" Mr. Sam Smith asked. "Good girl. She seemed to like me. I think I'm going to win this argument," replied John. "We'll see," said Ben. He had put John up to the bet while they were at the lake. Noticing the look in his friend's eyes, he said, "Nice girl, but I don't think you'll get anywhere. She's not likely to turn her eyes on the average bloke. That girl's out of your league, bro." But John looked at her with burning eyes, unable to look away. He really did like her very much, but his friend's words hit the young and proud lad's ego. "You'll see, she'll be mine," he said eagerly. "Want to bet?" Ben immediately got into the game. They said nothing about the bet to the rest of their friends, and only Anne heard everything. She was very fond of John, and she was following him around, dreaming of getting him. But the boy seemed to ignore all her attempts to get closer to him. That evening she followed him and saw him go to Helen. Resentment and anger were very strong, but she tried not to give the appearance that she knew everything. Helen greeted the new day with the sun shining through the window. She stretched sweetly. She smiled as she remembered last night. "Wake up, sleepyhead. It's time for breakfast," her aunt called her affectionately. "5 minutes and I'll be ready," Helen said. She quickly slipped her feet into her slippers and hurried to the bathroom. After changing, she entered the kitchen when everything was ready for breakfast. "I'm sorry, I haven't helped you at all," she apologized. "Stop it. It's my pleasure to take care of you. You don't know how important it is to know that you have someone to take care of you," she said. Feeling that she might cry at any moment, she decided to change the subject. "By the way, I heard voices under our window tonight." She looked questioningly at her niece, smiling slyly. "Yes, that bloke we saw at the lake came round. He wanted to meet me," Helen said, and a blush covered her face. "Well, I hope he succeeded," replied the aunt. "He did," she said, blushing even more. "Only I don't know how to behave with boys," she confessed. "You don't need to know anything. If you like him, you should behave as your heart tells you. Just be yourself," the woman replied. At 12, they had a lot of things to do, so Helen was only able to free herself by evening. And just as she entered the house, she heard a quiet knock on the door. Opening it, she froze in place. Helen was sitting on the veranda with Mrs. Emma when John came up to them with a bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. "Thank you," Helen smiled, accepting the bouquet. "How about a walk around the town?" "I don't know," the girl replied excitedly. "I need to shower and change, but I really want to walk with you." "Great. "I'll wait for you on the porch," John said. "I hope your aunt doesn't mind?" Helen shrugged her shoulders. "I guess not." When John came out, she rushed into the shower, wondering what she should wear for the walk. Once ready, Helen smiled at her reflection in the mirror and stepped out. John was sitting on the veranda with Aunt Emma. They were drinking tea and chatting sweetly. Helen, the aunt, appealed as the girl approached. "This young man asks permission to take a walk with you. I had to meet him so I could let you go in peace." Helen looked at her questioningly. "I see he's a nice chap, so I'm letting you go." Noticing her niece's tension, Mrs. Emma hurried to leave them alone. This day, John behaved more easily than the day before. He joked a lot and told interesting stories. Helen learned that he was studying to be a doctor and dreamed of becoming a specialist in cardiology. She, in turn, told about her passion for painting. "That's great. Can I see your paintings?" John asked with interest. "They are all left at home, in my studio. But I could paint a picture especially for you," Helen suggested. "That would be great," said the boy. John behaved very gallantly, not allowing himself too much. The walk ended in the late evening, leaving both only positive emotions. From that day, the young people were inseparable. John had been picking up Helen since morning. They returned sometimes in the morning. Mrs. Emma did not hinder their meetings. On the contrary, she liked John very much. Besides, she could see that her niece was truly in love. Helen felt that John was her man, and even if he was not rich, that was not the main thing. The main thing she realized was that he had the same feelings for her. Of course, her father may be against their relationship, but Helen tried not to think about it and just enjoy communication with her beloved. The couple often discussed joint plans for the future, where they could no longer imagine themselves apart. "It's the first time I've been like this," said John, sitting on the shore of the lake, which has become their favorite place for dates. "I can't be without you for a minute. I've had other girls before, but this is nothing like what I feel for you." John pulled Helen to him and kissed her gently. "What about Anne? Did you go out with her too?" the girl asked with a smile. "No, although I know her desire to be with me. But now I don't need anyone but you," the boy said, looking Helen straight in the eyes. "I will love you always. No matter what happens," he whispered, not taking his eyes off her. The girl was a little embarrassed, for it was the first time she had heard such words. Nevertheless, the holiday was coming to an end, bringing closer the time of the inevitable parting with her beloved and with this beautiful place. It seemed as if Helen had never really lived before this trip. Although she and John had agreed to meet as soon as they arrived, an inexplicable sadness never left her. "Tonight is our last night. You'll be gone tomorrow," John said sadly. "You make it sound like we'll never see each other again," Helen smiled, snuggling into the boy who was the most important person in her life. They were sitting on a hill surrounded by pine trees. They had a beautiful view of their favorite lake. John had brought a blanket and a basket of picnic supplies. "I love you very much," he said, "as much as I possibly can." Helen looked John straight in the eye as she confessed her love. There was no doubt of her sincerity. She gently touched his lips with her own, pressing herself against him. That was the day they decided to spend the night together. It was their last meeting. This time their date didn't end until dawn, and in the evening Helen already had a train ticket. "I'll definitely come to see you off," John whispered goodbye. As she packed her things, Helen remembered her promise to give John the painting. By the way, it was ready. She wanted to leave him something to remember it by. Slowly gathering herself, the girl grabbed the gift and headed towards the house where John and his friends lived. As she got closer, Helen felt an incomprehensible excitement, but continued on her way. The door was opened for her by Anne. "Could you get John for me, please?" Helen asked. "John's gone to town. Didn't you know?" Anne looked at the bewildered Helen with undisguised gloating. "Why should he have to answer to you, though? Who are you? He got everything he wanted from you." The girl laughed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Helen sat down on the bench outside the house, feeling her legs shaking from the sudden realization. "What's there to understand? John and his mates bet that he'd sleep with you. You seemed so unapproachable at first. And then yesterday he told me what happened. He got fed up with you, so he left. Do you understand? Helen couldn't believe what she was hearing. She could feel that John loved her. Was it really possible to play at being in love so skillfully? She heard Anne say something else to her, but she hurried away. Waiting for the train on the platform, Helen looked at the faces of the passers-by, hoping to see the face she loved so dearly among them. She hoped that he would come, explain everything, hug and comfort her. But time passed and he was still gone. "Sweetheart, what's the matter with you? Your face is gone." Her aunt, who was seeing her off, was worried. Of course she understood who her niece was looking for in the crowd. "It's all right. It's all right. Thank you for a wonderful holiday. If it hadn't been for you." Helen stammered and cried, throwing herself around her aunt's neck. A few minutes later, they heard the announcement of an incoming train and hurriedly calmed down. V. He never came. Helen's mind was spinning as the train moved off. So Anne was telling the truth, she concluded. She had time to think about it. Eventually, she realized that everything had happened exactly as Anne had said. How else would she have known about their intimacy the day before? Thinking about the fact that John had told his friends about it with ease, perhaps in great detail, was vile and disgusting. How could he? Resentment was slowly being replaced by anger. Her father's driver was waiting for her on the platform and carefully put her things into the car. At home, she was met by the usual cold silence. It even seemed to Helen that the holiday had been just a dream. A note from her father on the table in her room said she would see him tonight and have some important conversation. Glancing at the portrait of her mother on the shelf, Helen barely held back tears. Suddenly, she realized that she had no one at all to share her worries with. A little later, Mrs. Kate came in. She missed her pupil sincerely, and so did Helen. But there was something about her behavior that was unsettling. The woman cast pitying glances in Helen's direction. And when asked, she was careful to change the subject. Her father came late in the evening when Helen had given up hope of waiting for him and was about to go to bed. He knocked gently on the door of her room. "Are you awake?" he asked, and receiving a negative answer, entered quietly. As Helen sat down in the armchair opposite her daughter, she realized that she missed her father very much. For a moment, she wanted to throw herself into his arms to cuddle like a little girl. But when she assessed the situation, she changed her mind. Her father hadn't seen her in almost 2 months, and not a single muscle in his face betrayed any emotion when they met. Helen's heart clenched as she glanced at her mother's photo. Helen dared to ask, "What did you want to talk to me about?" "Your birthday is coming up," said her father. "I've decided to organize an evening at the Count's restaurant. There will be a lot of important people there. I'll introduce you to a lot of people." "Thank you. But why do I need these people?" The girl timidly objected. "I'd rather celebrate my birthday with my family." "That's out of the question. I've made up my mind. Besides, the preparations for the party are in full swing. You have to outshine everyone. You have time to get ready." My father got up and headed for the door. "Good night," he said and walked out. Helen sat down with her legs tucked up. Her phone vibrated, announcing an incoming message. It was from Aunt Emma. She was worried. Helen smiled. She hadn't received such warmth in a long time. Communicating with her aunt helped to take her mind off her unpleasant thoughts for a while. Saying goodbye, the girl fell into a deep sleep. The new morning greeted her with drizzling rain and cold wind. The sky was covered with bulky gray clouds, giving no chance for a single ray of light to shine through. Helen sighed heavily as she looked out the window. The weather completely reflected the state of her soul. Every minute she thought of John and what he had done. Her heart leapt out of her chest and tears welled up in her eyes at the memory of him. Wrapping herself in a warm blanket, Helen went to her little workshop. There she was finally able to distract herself. Taking in her hands brushes and paints, the girl plunged into painting. Remembering the native features of the face, Helen wrote a portrait of her lover, who broke her heart. Helen did not notice how the time flew by. She woke up only when she heard the sound of the front door opening and her father's loud voice. Helen looked down and was startled to see that her father had clearly been drinking, as evidenced by his awkward movements and his extremely wrinkled and unkempt appearance. "I said no, all right," Mr. Sam Smith shouted. To sell the factory is to admit bankruptcy. I'll find a way out. Helen tried not to let her father see her like this. It was the first time she'd ever seen him drunk in her life. Something terrible must have happened, Helen thought. She couldn't explain her father's behavior otherwise. Slowly, the girl made her way to the kitchen, so as not to run into her father. She began to wait for Mrs. Kate. "Helen, what are you doing here at this hour?" the woman asked with a surprised raised eyebrow as she entered the kitchen. "I need to talk to you." "Did you see the state your father came in?" "Yes, but you shouldn't worry about that. He's been a little overworked lately. I guess he decided to relax," the woman said quickly, not looking at her. "He's drunk out of his mind. I've never seen him like that." "What happened? Do you know anything about it?" "I'm the only one who doesn't know." "I don't know anything, but I assure you it's all right. Now go to bed. It's getting late." Mrs. Kate tried to end the conversation quickly. Helen didn't sleep well that night. The feeling of uneasiness did not leave her. John's face and Anne's haughty face came to mind. That's why she woke up in a bad mood with a sore head. Her father was not present at breakfast, so Helen resolutely went in search of him in his study. She was determined to find out what was going on with him. The door to the study was ajar, and she ventured in without knocking. Mr. Sam Smith sat leaning back in his chair, thinking about something. His eyes were red, proving that he had spent this night without sleep. When he heard his daughter's footsteps, he flinched. "Helen?" He was surprised to see her. "Come in, we need to talk." The girl sat down across from him and waited intently. "You're old enough to understand the things we're going to talk about. I hope for your support." The beginning did not bode well. That's why Helen inwardly tensed up. "My firm is in a critical state. I'm on the verge of bankruptcy. Plus, I'm in massive debt. What to do about it, I don't know yet." Helen sat there completely bewildered. She didn't know what to do next, but one thing was certain: she had to make arrangements for her future. Mr. Sam Smith paused, trying not to look his daughter in the eye. "Your birthday is coming up," he said. "As promised, I'm going to give you a big party." But Papa Helen wanted to reassure her father, for it was the first time in years that he seemed so pathetic and smaller in stature. She wanted to argue that she didn't need this holiday at all, that it wasn't worth spending money on it, which was scarce now. But her father interrupted her sharply. "The matter is settled," he said. "Please listen to me to the end and do not interrupt me. This evening I will introduce you to your future husband." Helen was so shocked that she was speechless for a while. Only after a few minutes did she speak in a quiet voice. "I don't understand how you can make such decisions for me. Who gave you that right? I'm a free man, and there's a man I'm in love with. So your plans aren't going to work out." Helen looked defiantly into her father's eyes, not expecting herself to be so bold. There was no reply, so she got up and went silently to her room. It was the first time she had ever objected to her father, so it made her feel sick to her stomach, and even more so that he had decided to control her fate without her knowledge. When she opened the only photo of her and John in her phone, she cried. For the next few days, she tried not to leave the room unnecessarily. Her father, too, seemed to avoid talking to her. From Mrs. Kate, she learned that he came late from work and almost always drunk. The time on the calendar was approaching the day of her birth. One night before going to bed, Mr. Sam Smith came to make up with his daughter. He spoke so softly and was as affectionate as he had been in his distant childhood when her mother was alive. "All I'm doing is looking after you, darling," he said. "I don't want you to be on the street, because anything could happen. Michael's a good man and he's been wanting to get to know you for a long time, so don't push him away. He'll make a good husband." He said many other things about the mysterious fiancé, marveling at his intelligence and success. They talked till nearly midnight, and Helen promised to think hard. In the morning, when it was barely dawn, she decided to call her aunt for advice. She knew that she would be awake by now, for in the village the time was very early in the morning. "Helen, my girl, how glad I am to hear from you," said Aunt Emma. Her voice brought an involuntary smile to her lips. There was so much I wanted to say and ask, but the lump in my throat prevented me from doing either. "How are you doing? Why are you silent?" Aunt Emma asked warily. "I don't know," Helen said and cried. She was rambling, but she recounted the events of the last few days. There was silence on the other end. "Did John ask about me? Had you seen him?" Helen asked timidly. "No, I haven't. They left the village the same day you did," said her aunt. "Please, darling, don't cry. We'll think of something. I'll talk to your father. But you can't marry against your will. It's like the Stone Age." She resented it. After a little talk with her aunt, Helen began to calm down, having received the support of someone close to her. Her aunt promised to call back in a couple of days, assuring her that everything would be all right. She did call back. But this time the conversation didn't bring Helen any comfort. Aunt Emma confusedly advised her niece to take a closer look at Michael and not to be too hasty. Helen was surprised at the change in Aunt Emma's mood, for now everyone was against her. On the eve of the party, her father had brought her a fancy dress in which she was to appear in front of the guests. Helen absolutely did not want to have any fun. Every night she locked herself in her studio. She expressed all her pain and longing in her paintings. Her thoughts took her back to the short time she had spent with her lover. The events of the festive evening unfolded rapidly. She and her father arrived at the restaurant just in time. Many strangers frightened her and made her uncomfortable, but she had to hand it to her father, for he stayed with her almost the whole evening. Looking at the faces of the guests, Helen wondered which one of them was Michael. To her surprise, for almost half of the evening he was not visible among the guests. A pleasant slow tune began to play, and couples began to walk out into the center of the room. Looking round, Helen didn't realize she was alone. Her father had discreetly disappeared somewhere. "Would the birthday girl do me the honor of dancing this slow dance with me?" Helen heard a man's voice behind her. Turning round, she saw a man who, smiling, was staring at her intently. Without waiting for an answer, he drew her imperiously to him and drew her into the crowd of dancing couples. Throughout the dance, the stranger did not utter another word. Helen waited impatiently for the music to end. After all, the man was clearly overstepping his bounds, pressing her so tightly that she could hardly breathe. Finally, the music ended and he disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. Suddenly, a bright light came on, and her father's loud voice came through the microphone. "Dear friends, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the birthday party of my only and favorite daughter." It was clear that Mr. Sam Smith had already knocked over more than one glass of champagne. "In addition, I would like to introduce my future son-in-law and announce the engagement of my daughter and Michael." The guests clapped and some even started whistling. Helen was more excited than ever. Suddenly, the stranger with whom she had been dancing stepped towards her and put his arm around her waist and stood beside her. "Friends," the father continued, "I also want to inform you that Michael is my companion from today. Please love and welcome him." A satisfied smile was on the face of the new bridegroom. He was obviously pleased with himself, and what was happening brought him pleasure. Helen was the only one in the crowd of guests who felt like an extra at the party. She looked at the groom and sighed louder than etiquette allowed. This was not what she had imagined the groom to look like. She had thought he would be about her age or a little older. She even thought she might get used to him and perhaps even like him. After all, it had happened more than once in some people's lives. That was what Mrs. Kate tried to assure her every evening, telling her various stories about people she knew. "Patience is the best medicine, Helen. In the old days, nobody asked anybody about love. The bride and groom's parents would agree, that's all. And over the years, people became a real family," the woman said. "Well, that was in the old days. Now everyone marries for love," Helen objected. "And how can you love a man you've never met? What if we don't like each other?" Helen asked Mrs. Kate. "Well, how can you not like me? You can't find a beauty like that anywhere." But little by little, in the course of such discussions, Helen herself began to set herself up for a favorable outcome. "After all, if he disgusts me, it's not by force that my father will force me to marry," thought the girl. And now, standing near her fiancé, who was 10 or perhaps 15 years older than she was, Helen found herself at a complete loss. Someone was coming up with congratulations, but she heard nothing at all. John's face came back into her imagination, so dear and beloved. And that groom was standing there smiling arrogantly, clasping her as if she were his property. She got out of his embrace and walked away from the crowd. Helen sat on the sofa in the lobby, letting the tears flow freely down her cheeks. Making sure no one was around, she didn't hold back her emotions. Tears of joy? Hearing a woman's voice, Helen turned around. Standing next to her was a pretty slim brunette with a glass of champagne. "I'm sorry, I'm Helen. I don't know what to say," she said, addressing the stranger. "It's okay, don't apologize," she said. "My name is Caroline." She extended her hand for a handshake and smiled. "Let me offer you a glass of champagne in honor of our acquaintance." Helen nodded. "Why not? A little relaxation and distraction wouldn't be a bad idea right now." At a table in the far corner of the room, the girls chatted casually. "You're a good girl," Caroline said. "Honestly, I thought you were arrogant, considering who your father is." Helen just smiled back, unable to find anything to say. "And my fiancé dumped me today," Caroline said with a sigh. "Can you imagine he just said that it was over between us, and that he was going to marry someone else? How could he do that? You're so beautiful." Helen tried to console her. "I guess money is everything in this life. No one needs love anymore," Caroline said sadly. "But I believe in love, and so do you. He'll regret what he did, and he'll come back." Helen had no sooner finished than she noticed Mr. Sam Smith and Michael approaching their table. "What are you doing here?" he asked Caroline rudely. "Just congratulating the bride." "Don't worry, I was just leaving," she replied, standing up and heading for the exit. "What right do you have to send my guests away?" Helen asked her father sternly. "She wasn't on the guest list," he replied. "Don't worry, dear, I'm just keeping you from unnecessary contact," Mr. Michael added with a strained smile that looked more like a grin. "Let me decide for myself what socializing I want and what I don't want," Helen objected rudely. Apologizing, she followed Caroline, but to her dismay, the girl had already left the restaurant. Helen spent the rest of the evening trying to avoid everyone, including her own father. She was anxious to get home as soon as possible to get her thoughts together. When the evening was finally over, Helen was relieved when she went into her room and sat down on her bed, completely exhausted. There was no point in talking to her father tonight, but tomorrow the conversation was bound to happen. That was what Helen decided as she fell asleep. Waking up, and without waiting for breakfast, the girl headed for her father's study. He was already there. "We need to talk," Helen began abruptly. Her father looked at his daughter in bewilderment. This was a tone she had never used with him before. "I don't want to marry Mr. Michael. Please let him know that," she said. "The matter of your marriage is settled and non-negotiable," said her father again. "Michael is a very promising young man. You'll get on well with him." "Young? He's at least 10 years older than I am," Helen objected. "Besides, I don't like him at all. Arrogant and presumptuous. I don't want to marry him, Papa." "He couldn't help it," he shouted. "Enough. I've already told you that my finances are bad and we might end up on the street," Dad said. "So I'm concerned about your future." "It's a pity, Dad, that for the first time in my life I'll have to go against your will," Helen said quietly. "I want to love and be loved too. Have you forgotten how happy it is to live with someone you love?" She knew she had touched a sore subject. Her father was still suffering from the loss of his wife and tried not to talk about such topics. Suddenly, he sank into a chair, lowered his head, and sobbed. Helen was shocked by what was happening and did not know how to behave. "I always loved your mother. I worshipped her," he said through his sobs. "And believe me, I haven't forgotten what happiness is like. After losing her, I concentrated on my work, trying to distract myself from the pain and emptiness that had settled in my heart. I put everything on the line for my success. Things have been going from bad to worse lately. My competitors have been investigating me. I've had to suspend production. Creditors are calling in debts, and I can't pay them. Michael offered to work with me and help me financially. He has a lot of connections in all the agencies, and in return he wanted to be my son-in-law." Her father looked her straight in the eye. "Please, my daughter, agree," he pleaded. "Don't break your old man's heart. I won't survive the loss of the firm." Helen silently walked out of the office. There were no tears. Thoughts were jumbled in her head. She went up to the studio and began to paint furiously, without stopping for a moment. She didn't come out until the next morning. A worried Mrs. Kate was waiting for her. "Helen, what's the matter?" she asked. "I'm all right," she replied dryly. "Tell my father that I agree. Tell him to start preparing for the wedding." As the door closed behind Mrs. Kate, Helen spoke aloud, looking at her mother's picture. "I'll do what he wants for you, Mum. I don't want him to suffer for using me as a bargaining chip. Let that be on his conscience." From that day on, Helen became completely indifferent to everything that happened next. The days passed in the hustle and bustle of the wedding. The endless fitting of the wedding dress and other preparations were of no interest to Helen. She saw Michael twice more when he came to see her father, and then only in passing. He seemed to have no tenderness or interest in the bride. On the day of the wedding, Helen stood in her gorgeous wedding dress, trying to fight back tears. A multitude of guests took turns saying their congratulations and wishing happiness and love to the young ones. The bride thought about her own thoughts and listened to almost nothing. Occurring periodically, nausea and dizziness did not give rest. The fact is that a fortnight before the planned celebration, Helen learned that she was pregnant. This news at first caused a wild horror, and then she realized that in this way she would find the meaning of life, and the baby is her salvation from loneliness. That the father of the child, John, there was no doubt, as Helen was no one else Helen was close to. This fact both pleased and frightened her. On the one hand, the child would be a part of the man she loved. Helen did not want to have children from her unloved husband. But how would Michael feel about it? After all, he would surely find out. Helen tried not to think about that for now. She was worried about Aunt Emma's absence at the party. She was the person she most wanted to see. But neither her father nor Mrs. Kate could explain clearly why Auntie was not on the guest list. Her phone was silent in all Helen's attempts to reach her. The groom socialized more with the guests than with the bride. Only occasionally, under the shouts of bitter, he roughly grabbed her for a kiss. When the celebration was over, she had to get home alone. Of course, a car with a driver was waiting for her near the restaurant. It could not be otherwise, given the financial situation of the newly married husband. Only he, unfortunately, got so drunk at the end of the evening that he fell asleep on the sofa in the restaurant lobby. Helen couldn't help but feel relieved that she would have to spend the night alone. But to her surprise, the next day Michael did not show any interest in her. On the contrary, he deliberately went to bed in another room, dropping a greeting as he went. He made no further conversation with her. Helen didn't know how she should react to this behavior. On the one hand, she didn't want to be intimate with her husband, but on the other hand, she wondered why he was trying so hard to make her his wife when now it was as if he didn't notice, or even ignored her. There were more questions than answers. So after a few days of tense silence, Helen decided to talk to her husband, which she later regretted. Waking up before Michael, she hurried to the kitchen and made him coffee. After making a simple breakfast for herself, she poured tea and waited for her husband. Michael came downstairs and caught Helen's questioning look. "You didn't have to strain yourself," he said. "I never have breakfast at home." Having said that, he took the cup with the coffee prepared for him and defiantly poured it into the sink. "What's going on? Will you bother to explain why you're avoiding me?" "I don't understand anything." Helen tried to speak calmly, so as not to give away her excitement. "Don't fill your pretty head with unnecessary things," dear Michael said playfully. "And don't have any illusions about my great love. You are only a good investment in my capital." Having said that, the man turned round and left. Helen felt as if she were chained to the chair. She had thought that if she didn't fall in love, she could surely be a good friend to her husband. But now? For the next few days, Helen hardly left her room. The constant nausea and bouts of dizziness were unrelenting, and every bite she ate was asking to go out. So she tried to lie down more, occasionally sending maids for tea or milk. She had not yet seen a doctor, but she was determined to do so when she felt better. But everything was decided by chance. One evening, without waiting for the maid to come, she decided to go down to the kitchen for tea. Helen felt sick and fainted before she reached the dining room. The maid came running to the noise, followed by Michael, who had recently returned from work. Helen woke up in her room. Nearby were Michael and a man in a white coat. "You're awake, my dear," the doctor said affectionately. "How long has it been with you?" "Not very long," Helen answered reluctantly and turned away. Well, it's all clear. Congratulations, Mr. Smith. Your wife will soon give you an heir, the doctor said cheerfully. That's very interesting, Michael said thoughtfully. Thank you, doctor. I think you should go now. I'd like to be alone with my wife, he said to the doctor in a tone that did not tolerate objections. A moment later, they were alone. Helen held her breath, waiting for accusations and possibly a divorce. Get some rest. I won't bother you, Michael said. Tomorrow you'll go with the driver and register at the antenatal clinic. And also don't forget that you need to eat a full meal and be outdoors more often. And for the first time kissed his wife on the cheek. Michael went out. Helen's thoughts were jumbled in her head. Michael's actions did not fit with their last conversation. The fact that the child was not his was clear to everyone, but he didn't show it. And even when the doctor left, he didn't change his tactics. The next day, Helen went to the doctor to register her pregnancy. The term turned out to be almost 3 months, exactly how long it had been since she had last seen John. The girl tried to chase away the thoughts of him, because they necessarily caused tears and worries. And she couldn't be nervous now. Having plunged headlong into the expectation of the baby, Helen almost tried not to pay attention to the strange behavior of her husband. And there were strange behaviors. Now he controlled her every move. She couldn't go anywhere without her driver. It was only when she went to her father's house that she was able to be away from the eyes that were always watching her. Helen lacked communication, and so, finding one day in the pocket of her coat a note with Caroline's phone number, the girl was overjoyed and immediately dialed the number. Caroline, it's Helen. Remember at my birthday party? Of course I remember, Caroline answered quickly. How are you? Would you like to meet? I'd love to, Helen replied. The girls agreed to meet in the park in the evening. The meeting went beautifully. The girls chatted a lot about everything. It even seemed to Helen that they had known each other for years. So how do you like marriage? Caroline asked timidly. Sighing heavily, Helen replied. I don't know. We're strangers, and we don't talk much. Only about the pregnancy. But I can't help it. I promised my father. Helen felt tears come to her eyes. Didn't you marry for love? Any girl would be happy to be Michael's wife, Caroline said. Maybe, but not me. The day I got engaged, I saw him for the first time. And my father had already made up his mind for me. And even though my heart belongs to someone else, I can't betray my father. It's important to him. And he's the only family I have, Helen said sadly. Caroline was silent. For the rest of the walk, she was very thoughtful and taciturn. But saying goodbye, the girls agreed to meet again in a couple of days. The next morning, Helen had an unpleasant conversation with her husband. Who did you see yesterday? He asked as soon as Helen came down to breakfast. A friend. What does it matter? Or am I not allowed to do that anymore? Helen looked into Michael's eyes. His hard stare made her uncomfortable. Here's the deal. I forbid you to see her. Is that clear? He asked in a raised tone. What right do you have to control my life? Helen shouted, unable to hold back her tears. I'm not your property, Michael. You're wrong, darling. And soon you will be convinced of it. Her husband smiled haughtily, reminiscent of a grin. Helen silently stood up and went to her room, wiping her tears. The following evening, she decided to have a serious talk with her father. This couldn't go on any longer. Entering her father's study, she began at once about the main thing. Father, I can't go on like this. I want a divorce. Hearing her words, her father turned very pale. Are you crazy, daughter? How could you think such a thing? Imagine I could. I can't live with Michael any longer, so I'm asking you to settle your business matters, after which I'll file for divorce. It took a lot of courage and effort for Helen to talk to her father like that. Deep down, she felt insanely sorry for him, but no less sorry for herself. All right, replied her father at last. But I need a few months to sort things out because your husband has half the shares in my firm. Be patient for a while and then do what you want. Father waved his hand and walked out silently. He never came down for dinner. In vain they waited for him with Mrs. Kate. "Oh dear, I don't like this," said the woman, sharing her worries. "Mr. Sam Smith has been drinking a lot lately, smoking a lot, and not sleeping much. He must be in a bad way." "That's odd. He told me that things had improved since the wedding," Helen thought. The next day, Helen phoned Caroline to arrange a meeting, but she refused, citing illness. Her voice trembled. Helen was alarmed by this, so she decided to visit her friend, taking all precautions. After all, it was absolutely impossible for her to be ill right now. The driver took her to her father's house, and from there, coming out through another entrance, Helen took a taxi to her friend's house. The appearance of the friend struck Helen. "Who did this?" She pointed to the huge bruise and bruising on Caroline's cheek. "It doesn't matter. You don't know him anyway." Caroline brushed it off and went to put the kettle on, making it clear that she didn't want to discuss the subject. Helen didn't press her friend. When she wants to, she'll tell you, she thought. There were men's things in the flat, although Caroline had said she lived alone. After chatting for a while, Helen left her friend and drove home. She couldn't be late, or Michael would suspect her of lying. She was frankly afraid of him lately. Of course, he hadn't done anything bad to her yet, but sometimes he looked at her like that, or spoke in a tone that sent shivers down her spine. So Helen decided not to make her husband angry. In the evening, Michael said that one day his cousin and his fiancée were coming to visit them. "Please prepare everything for their arrival," he said sternly. "Everything must be dignified. I hope I am understood." Helen nodded in response. Selecting an outfit to meet the guests, Helen wore a soft blue dress in the color of her eyes, a little loose cut, although it was hard not to notice the belly, which was growing every day. On Helen's orders, the servants had prepared a festive dinner of poultry and numerous appetizers. As Helen went down to the table, she heard the sound of voices coming from the living room. Apparently, Michael had arrived at the same time as the guests, because his voice was the clearest. For a moment, Helen froze. One of the voices sounded very familiar to her. Her heart pounded frantically. Her legs became cotton woolly. The girl could not move from her seat. "Meet my dear brother." "My wife Helen," Michael introduced her. John stood in front of her, amazed as much as she was, and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, John," he said. Behind him stood Anne, smiling wryly. For a moment, Helen thought she was going to faint. "Are you all right? You don't look well." Noticing the pallor on her face, John asked. "Don't worry, brother. It's just that my wife is pregnant, and I'm going to have an heir soon," Michael laughed. "Congratulations," John replied quietly. "Well, let's go to the table," he said. John found himself across from Helen at the table and kept his eyes on her. Anne was angry and tried to distract her fiancé. "I'm sorry, Michael, that we couldn't come to your wedding. John is literally obsessed with his studies. And after he was invited to work at the cardiac center, I don't see him at home." Anne gave John a defiant hug, glancing defiantly at the pale Helen. "I hope you'll come to our wedding." "And how soon will it be?" Michael asked. "We haven't decided anything yet, so it's too early to talk about it," John cut in. Anne was silent. It was obvious that she was hurt by the words. When it was time for the hot meal, Michael suddenly shouted, "Well, who do you think will eat this rubbish?" He turned to his wife, pointing at the roast turkey. "I thought everyone would like it," Helen replied, confused. "Next time, before you think with your chicken brain, consult your husband." Michael couldn't stop himself. Apparently, the strong drinks were doing their job. "I don't see what the problem is. I have a great respect for turkey." John stood up for Helen. "Don't," she whispered, looking at him. Tears glistened in her eyes. She left the table and walked quickly to her room. "Why do you treat your wife like that, and even a pregnant wife? Hasn't time changed you at all?" John asked. "She deserved it. Besides, I don't need counselors," Michael replied gruffly. "I agree with Michael. Why serve something your husband doesn't like?" Anne interjected. "Shut up. You're so pleased you spoke your mind today." John looked at Anne with annoyance. "All right, spit it out. Why did you come here?" "I'm guessing it wasn't out of love for your cousin," Michael asked. and the men went out onto the veranda to continue their conversation in private. Helen was crying hard in her room. Her feelings were overwhelming her, and now they were bursting out. She realized that she still loved John. That made the pain seem even worse. That evening, John and Anne stayed the night. Helen realized this when she caught John having a cup of coffee in the kitchen in the early hours of the morning. "Hi, will you join us?" John asked. "No, thanks. I think you should wait for your fiancé." "I'll have tea in my room," Helen replied. "Your room? Are you and Michael in separate rooms?" "I'm sorry, but I don't think that's any of your business," Helen sneered, and taking the cup of tea she had prepared, was about to turn round and leave when she felt John grab her arm. "I think we need to talk." Helen stared silently into his eyes, in which she was sinking by the minute. She realized that the conversation was inevitable, but she tried to delay it. "What is there to talk about? How you bet your friends that you could easily get me into bed? Or maybe you want to tell me how long you laughed at me after it happened?" Helen's voice trembled, tears welling up in her eyes. "What argument? What nonsense? I was shocked when you left without even saying goodbye. I ran to your aunt, but she asked me to leave you alone. I begged her for your address, but she was adamant. I tried to find you, but I realized I didn't even know your surname." John stopped talking. "I don't believe you," Helen sighed. "Especially now it doesn't matter. You don't love him now, and you're unhappily married. It doesn't concern you. You made your choice back then." Helen pulled her hand from his and ran upstairs. Her temples throbbed, her heart was pounding so hard that it seemed it would burst out of her chest. The girl dialed Caroline's number and told her everything. "What do you think you're going to do?" she asked her friend. "I don't know," Helen sobbed. "I don't know anything. Maybe you should tell him he's having your baby." Caroline had been privy to the secret for a long time lately. She was the only person Helen could share it with. The girl, sincerely sympathized with her friend, was aware of the rather strange relationship between her and her husband. He had a wedding coming up. Why should he know that? "Perhaps Anne will soon give him her children," Helen replied sadly. "Don't worry, we'll think of something. Besides, your father has promised to sort things out and authorize the divorce. The most important thing is to stop being nervous in your condition. It's dangerous for the baby." Talking to her friend calmed Helen down a little. That day she decided not to go downstairs. And the next day there were no more guests. Time passed, but the father could not yet sort things out. The pregnancy was coming to its logical conclusion, so Helen was very worried. She never saw John again, although he had managed to give her his card with his contacts through the maid. Michael looked at her as if she was nothing, and sometimes snapped at her, picking on every little thing. On the due date, Helen gave birth to a beautiful baby girl and named her Mary after her mother. When she looked at her, she gasped. The baby was an exact copy of her father, even the mole on her left cheek inherited from him. She was met from the maternity hospital by a driver sent by her husband and Mrs. Kate and Caroline. On the first evening at home, there was a scandal. Michael came home from work drunk and immediately blamed his wife. "How worthless you are. You can't even give birth to a son. I wanted a son, an heir." "And what's this?" He pointed to the cradle where the baby was sleeping quietly. "What are you talking about, Michael? You knew it wasn't your child from the start, but you pretended it wasn't. What kind of heir are you talking about?" "Yeah, I can't have kids, okay? And I was counting on this baby. He was born in wedlock, which means no one would question our parentage. A girl wasn't part of my plan," he shouted. "You don't have to worry. We'll be going home soon, and you won't have to endure our presence," Helen replied as calmly as she could. Michael laughed and pushed Helen against the wall. "You're wrong," he whispered. "You have nowhere to go back to. Everything your father has is signed over to me. I've got him on a tight leash. He won't say a word against me. So unless you want me to throw him out on the street in his trousers and you and your bastard, I suggest you think twice." "What's all this for?" she asked, barely breathing. "In time you'll find out. Be patient, my dear. But I'm warning you. Don't do anything stupid. It could hurt Daddy, or Nanny, or our little girl." Michael laughed wildly. The baby cried. Helen rushed to comfort the baby. She was stunned. She realized that Michael was crazy. And now she was even more afraid of him. She had only been able to call her father once. She realized from the conversation she had had with him that he would not be supportive. He was clearly not well. As usual, he asked her to be patient a little longer. On the occasion of the baby's birth, Michael organized a party. All his friends were invited, and John and Anne. The party was taking place in the living room on the ground floor, so Helen preferred not to go down to the guests, for fear of leaving the baby alone for even a minute. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was John. "May I come in?" he asked timidly. Helen nodded silently. John walked over to the cot and looked at the baby girl. "She's so cute. I've never seen such pretty babies," he smiled. Helen's heart sank as she watched the tenderness with which John looked at his daughter. "I wish he hadn't noticed the resemblance," Helen repeated to herself. The girl cried, and she immediately picked her up in her arms. "Motherhood suits you. You're even more beautiful now," John said affectionately. Helen could hardly keep herself from throwing herself at his neck and telling him how she felt and who he was to her daughter. But suddenly, almost at the door, Anne's voice sounded. "You have to go now," Anne said sadly. "I hope I'll see you again." "At least I'd like to," John said quietly and went out. A fortnight later, the little girl was ill with a fever. There were no other symptoms. The girl screamed all the time. The antipyretics were almost ineffective. "Could you call a doctor, please?" Helen asked. "You don't need to bother your husband. It's just a cold," Michael assured her. "Please, the baby's not well." You can see that she begged. "All right. The doctor will be here tomorrow," Michael replied indifferently. All evening the girl was fussy. By nightfall, Helen realized that it was more serious than she had thought. The girl's lips had turned blue, and the attacks of suffocation caused wild horror to her mother. Not knowing what to do, Helen dialed John's number on her business card. "John, please help. My daughter is dying," Helen shouted into the phone. "I'll come over right now and call an ambulance." "Hurry, please." Helen couldn't find a place to go as she hastily gathered the necessary things for herself and the baby. She rushed downstairs with her daughter in her arms to wait for the ambulance. John arrived at the same time as the ambulance, having ordered them to take the girl to the cardiac center where he worked. Michael didn't come out to the noise, apparently sleeping very soundly after taking another drink. "What's wrong with the baby?" she asked John when he and the professor came out of the room. "The situation is complicated. The girl has a heart defect." "Did any of your relatives have a similar condition?" asked the professor. "Yes, my mom," Helen answered with trembling lips. "The girl needs an urgent operation. Do you give your consent?" "Yes, of course." "Then we need to sign the necessary documents and start the preparations," said the professor. At that moment, the phone in Helen's pocket rang. "How dare you leave with the child without my knowledge?" shouted into the receiver husband. "My daughter needs help, and I, as a mother, will do everything I can to help her. We're not coming home to you again. I'll file for divorce myself." Helen said what she'd been wanting to say for a long time. "What did you say? Divorce? There's one thing you haven't considered, dear. I'm the father of the baby, and with my connections, I could easily take her away from you." "You wouldn't do that." "You're wrong. That's why it's in your best interest to come back. Otherwise, you'll see," Michael said and disconnected. Clutching the phone, Helen felt a ringing in her ears and her eyes went dark. John picked up the fainting woman and carried her to his office. When Helen woke up, she smelled the pungent odor of ammonia. "I really need your help." In a pleading tone, she began the conversation. John nodded silently. "We need to register the car under someone else's name and surname. Otherwise, he'll find us," Helen said. John didn't ask any more questions, but within an hour, she had the child's card with the changed personal data. Helen stayed close to her daughter the whole time the operation was being prepared. She only left to wash or eat. John was always there, too. He knew that Michael was looking for his wife all over the city, but did not tell Helen. The most important thing now was the outcome of the operation. The girl was operated on by one of the best cardiologists in the city, John assisted. Those few hours that Annie was in the operating theater seemed to Helen an eternity. And only when John said that the worst was over and the operation was successful, Helen was able to breathe out. She cried, throwing herself into John's arms. "Annie is my daughter, isn't she?" he asked Helen, gently stroking her hair. She nodded, and he pulled her even tighter. Later, sitting in the hospital cafe, the young people were drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Suddenly, the music was interrupted by an urgent news bulletin. It was reporting a major fire in one of the houses in an upscale neighborhood in the city. Helen was horrified to hear her father's address. He had died in the fire, suffocated and unable to escape. Mrs. Kate was badly injured and was in hospital. Helen rushed to her. The woman said that it was probably arson, for the doors of the house were propped up from the outside. Because of this, they could not get out. She also told of a letter she had kept for Helen. "It was from your auntie. I opened it, don't swear, but it must have been necessary, because it was burnt. And I read it your aunt had been seriously ill lately, and her soul was longing to see you. She rang many times. Only Mr. Sam Smith forbade her to see you. Said she shouldn't mess with her head. Well, she sent me a letter before she died. No one but me ever saw it. She bequeathed the house in the village to you. She asked you not to leave it, and at the end she wrote, 'I hope you will find true happiness at your source,' said Mrs. Kate, and closed her eyes." Helen cried quietly. Suddenly she saw through the window Michael's car in the car park. The girl rushed down the corridor, looking for an emergency exit, because John was waiting for her in the car. "Hurry, he found me," Helen shouted, and the car whistled to a stop. In the mirror, she could see Michael's Jeep following them. "God, he won't spare us now. John, please," she pleaded. Michael caught up with them. One more spurt, and he could have blocked their path. But as fate would have it, a logging truck was in the oncoming lane and Michael's car slammed into it at full speed. John and Helen were sitting in the waiting room. "He wants to see you," the nurse announced. Helen entered the room where Michael was lying. He looked pathetic now. There were tubes literally everywhere, but he was conscious. "My only regret is that I didn't finish what I started," he whispered. "Why do you hate me so much? What have I done to you? You are his daughter and you should have suffered, just as I did when, before you were born, he met my mother. I was a little boy then. He tamed me, and I loved him. And so did Mum. Then he met your mum and easily threw us out of his life. Mum couldn't take it and started drinking. I was raised by relatives. All the while I was plotting my revenge and following his life. You were born into wealth, you had everything, money, loving parents. I had nothing, nothing at all, you know." Michael looked at Helen with contempt. "So I set out to succeed, to destroy your family. And I almost succeeded." Helen did not listen anymore, silently left the room. Michael survived, but became an invalid, confined to a wheelchair. He was cared for by Caroline, Helen's friend. As it turned out, Caroline had long been in love with Michael and had even dated him. At first, she was terribly jealous of Helen, but after getting to know her better, she became warm to her and tried to talk Michael out of his devious plans. A month later, Helen and John were taking their daughter home from the hospital. They were on their way to their new home, the village, the one that had bound their lives together forever. They were happy to be back to their roots,